Welcome back to the world of boring history for sleep, where the past is slow, repetitive, quietly unpleasant, and somehow deeply relaxing. There are few cities in the world like Venice, built on water, shaped by salt, and hardened by centuries of quiet resistance. It's one of the most unlikely human settlements to survive this long, and yet it has stood for over 1,000 years. Most great cities are built on solid ground, near rivers, crossroads, or fertile plains. Venice was not. It was built in mud, on wooden stilts, inside a shallow, unstable lagoon. It should not have lasted, but it did. This is not the story of grand battles or heroic kings. This is the story of slow effort, of cautious choices, of people who didn't set out to build a city, but who were forced to stay and slowly learned how. Venice was born out of fear. In the 5th century, as the Roman Empire collapsed in the west, the northern parts of Italy were invaded by tribes that pushed deep into once protected cities. The people fled, not to higher ground, but to the edge of the sea. They found temporary safety in the marshes, on small islands barely above water. It was never meant to be permanent. But as the threats on the mainland grew, so did the settlements in the lagoon. What began as a handful of huts became a scattered network of villages, floating just above the tide. Over centuries, they adapted to the environment. They learned to build with wood that could survive underwater. They developed systems to trade, to govern, and eventually to expand. Venice never had much land. It never had great armies. What it had was access, to trade routes, to open water, and to silence. It used all of them carefully. This series will explore how that small, fragile community became a powerful republic. Not by strength, but by structure. Not by conquest, but by control. Venice expanded its influence through slow diplomacy, cautious alliances, and a deep understanding of limits, environmental, political, and cultural. We'll look at how the city was built, what it sacrificed, how it resisted outside control, and how it slowly developed a system of governance unlike anything else in Europe. We'll explore trade routes, religious tensions, naval innovations, secret councils, and the slow, patient engineering that kept the sea at bay. Each segment will follow one part of Venice's long story, not told in haste, but in steady rhythm. This isn't the history of rise and fall. It's the history of staying, of sinking, adapting, and surviving. So if you're ready, settle in. We'll begin not with a cathedral or a king, but with a muddy island, a salt wind, and a few families trying to make shelter from the tide. When people think of Venice today, they imagine gondolas, marble bridges, and elegant plazas. But the real beginning was much simpler and much wetter. Venice started in a lagoon, a shallow stretch of brackish water along the northeastern coast of Italy, where the land slowly melts into the sea. It's not the kind of place where people usually choose to live. There was little solid ground, constant flooding, and barely any farmland. The tides came and went unpredictably, leaving behind salt deposits and slick mudflats. But in the 5th century, it became a place of refuge. At that time, the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. Northern Italy was no longer secure. Barbarian tribes from the north, including Goths, Huns, and Lombards, were pushing southward, raiding towns and sacking once great cities. The people of places like Padua, Aquileia, and Altinum had to choose between staying and fighting or fleeing. Many fled, but rather than heading inland or over the mountains, some moved out toward the sea. They settled among the scattered islands and muddy banks of the Venetian lagoon. It wasn't a promising place. There were no walls for protection, no arable land for farming, no forests for building materials. But that was the point. The same qualities that made the lagoon unappealing also made it safe. Invading armies couldn't bring horses or heavy carts across the mud. The tides worked like a natural barrier. At first, the settlements were temporary. People built small huts out of reeds and driftwood. They lived on fishing and salt collection. They didn't expect to stay for long. But as time passed and the mainland remained unstable, the temporary became permanent. That change, from survival to settlement, is what began the story of Venice. One of the early challenges was the land itself. The islands were small and unstable, and flooding was constant. If anything permanent was going to be built, it had to be done carefully. That's when the Venetians started developing a method that would become one of the city's foundations, literally. They learned to sink wooden piles deep into the muddy ground. These long logs, often made from alder wood, were driven through layers of soft soil until they reached firmer clay beneath. Once in place, they provided a stable platform. On top of the piles, the builders placed a wooden platform, then layers of stone or brick. Even though the wood was submerged, it lasted for centuries, protected from oxygen and decay by the water itself. This engineering approach allowed the Venetians to build entire neighborhoods on what seemed like unbuildable land. Over time, they created walkways, bridges, and canals, forming a strange kind of city without streets or wheels. At first, there was no single Venice. The lagoon was home to many small communities, each based on a different island or sandbar. They had their own local leaders and traditions, but they shared the same conditions: isolation, salt air, and dependence on boats. By the 7th century, some of these communities began to come together. The growing need for coordination, for trade, defense, and common rules pushed them toward unity. They formed early councils and assemblies, eventually leading to the creation of a central authority. That authority would evolve over time into the Venetian Republic. For now, though, life remained basic. Most people were fishermen or salt workers. Some crafted boats. Others traded with the mainland, exchanging salt and fish for grain, wood, and cloth. Trade became the city's lifeline, even in its earliest form. Salt, in particular, played a central role. The lagoon's conditions made it perfect for salt production, using evaporation pools and simple tools. Salt was a highly valuable commodity in the early medieval period, not just for flavor, but for preserving food. It became the currency of Venice's early influence. Meanwhile, religion also started to shape community life. Churches were small at first, simple wooden buildings serving tight-knit groups of settlers. But as stability grew, the churches became more important. They were places of gathering, of record-keeping, and of shared tradition. Despite these signs of progress, early Venice remained a city under pressure. The sea was not forgiving. Every structure required maintenance. Flooding was common. Storms were destructive. Disease moved easily in damp conditions. And fresh water, always limited, had to be carefully collected and stored. Still, people stayed. They built, repaired, adapted. Part of what made Venice different was this mindset. Most cities try to dominate their environment. They cut down forests, build walls, divert rivers. Venice had no choice but to cooperate. The sea could not be pushed back. The tides could not be ignored. So the city was built to move with the water, not against it. Boats were central. Everyone used them, for work, for travel, for carrying goods. Children learned to row almost as early as they learned to walk. Over time, different types of boats were developed for specific tasks, some for cargo, some for speed, some for fishing in shallow waters. Houses were built narrow and tall to make the most of limited space. Walkways followed the curve of canals. Community spaces were elevated slightly to resist flooding. Even daily routines were shaped by the tide charts. By the end of this early period, Venice was no longer just a survival camp. It was a functioning society, however small. It had its own habits, its own techniques, its own identity. It was not part of any mainland kingdom. It was not controlled by Rome. It belonged to the lagoon and to the people who had made it work. It wasn't rich. It wasn't grand. But it had found a way to live and to keep living in a place no one else wanted. As the scattered lagoon settlements stabilized, they slowly began to look more like a city, or at least something organized enough to resemble one. There were still no wide roads or large stone plazas, but patterns were forming. Some islands became known for their boat builders. Others were centers of fishing, salt production, or small-scale trade. Bit by bit, what had started as survival camps were becoming interdependent communities. Venice grew not outward, but inward, tightening its networks, building on top of what it had already built, and learning how to survive longer in a place that still wasn't entirely meant for human life. The most obvious challenge remained the foundations. Wood was the only viable material. It was light, available in the nearby forests of northeastern Italy and the Balkans, and it could be transported by boat. But building on waterlogged islands required more than just material. It required a system. By this point, the Venetians had refined their technique. To begin any new construction, laborers would sail in barges carrying hundreds of tree trunks. These were sharpened and driven vertically into the muddy lagoon bed. Each house, church, or warehouse might require hundreds of these piles, sometimes thousands. On top of them, they placed a platform of wooden beams, then a layer of stone to spread the weight. Even major buildings like early churches and administrative halls were built this way. The surprising part? Many of those wood piles still exist today, protected underwater from oxygen and decay. What began as a desperate engineering solution slowly became a lasting architectural foundation. But if the physical structures were stabilizing, the political structures were still loose. There was no duke, no king. Governance happened locally, often through small councils made up of elders or prominent traders. These councils managed disputes, organized construction projects, and helped coordinate defenses, not against armies, but against the environment. Occasionally, tensions would arise between the different islands. Each community had its own customs, priorities, and needs, but cooperation usually won out. The lagoon itself demanded unity. If one group neglected their canals or allowed waste to build up, it could affect the water quality for everyone. Flooding in one area might lead to problems in another. And so, even without a centralized government, the early Venetians learned to act with shared responsibility. Trade, as always, was a powerful motivator for cooperation. The salt pans in the lagoon produced large quantities of sea salt, which could be traded inland for grain, wine, and meat. Fish, especially dried or salted varieties, became another major export. Venice was also a gateway for goods moving between the Adriatic coast and northern Europe. Even at this early stage, small cargo boats from Venice were reaching as far south as Ravenna and as far north as Istria. Venetian merchants developed a reputation for being patient, careful negotiators. They rarely used force. Instead, they focused on building long-term relationships with inland traders, with coastal settlements, and with Eastern merchants connected to the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, based in Constantinople, still technically claimed Venice as part of their empire, but they didn't interfere much. The lagoon was distant and difficult to access. As long as some tribute was paid and no rebellions occurred, the imperial government largely ignored the settlements. This created a useful space for Venice, technically loyal to an empire, but practically independent. It was a pattern that would continue for centuries. Venice often aligned itself with powerful neighbors, but carefully maintained its freedom to act as it pleased. Meanwhile, the cultural identity of Venice was beginning to take shape. The city wasn't Latin in the traditional sense. It wasn't fully Greek either. It wasn't Roman, but it wasn't entirely barbarian. It was a mix. The settlers came from different parts of Italy. Their dialects blended. Their customs evolved. They built churches that followed Roman Christian models, but with local variations. They held festivals that reflected both old Roman holidays and lagoon-specific rhythms, like the timing of fishing seasons or salt harvesting. Life moved slowly, but it moved with purpose. Days began with the tide charts. Fishermen left early, timed to the ebb. Traders moved their goods when the water was calm. Salt workers watched the skies, hoping for long sunny stretches that would help the evaporation process. Boat builders worked constantly, repairing old vessels and crafting new ones for the growing demand. Children grew up learning to row, to recognize the wind direction, and to listen to the sound of shifting water against stone walls. They learned which parts of the city flooded at high tide. They learned how to catch crabs with their hands, and how to tie knots strong enough to hold in storms. The lagoon taught patience, and patience became one of Venice's deepest values. There was no hurry to expand. There was no space to waste. Every structure was designed carefully. Materials were reused. Even mistakes, a leaning wall, a sinking foundation, became part of the city's character. Rather than tear things down, Venetians found ways to reinforce, to adapt, and to build around what was already there. By the early 8th century, some of the islands had grown dense. Walkways had been paved with stone. Canals had been deepened and edged with wooden banks. A few churches had begun to take on permanent forms, no longer made of wood, but brick or stone. Trade was increasing. Boats came in daily from across the Adriatic, carrying goods and stories from far away. And yet, from a distance, Venice still looked fragile. A scattered city made of wood and water, without walls, surrounded by salt and marsh. But to the people who lived there, it was home, stable in its own way, steady in its growth, and full of potential. Not powerful yet, but watchful. Not rich yet, but steady. Not famous yet, but preparing. As Venice grew in size and complexity, it began to face a question that every developing society must eventually confront. Who was in charge? Unlike other cities of the time, Venice had no ruling noble family, no crowned monarch, and no direct control from a foreign empire. There were no castles or royal courts. There were local leaders on each island, usually respected elders or wealthier traders, but no unified head of state. In its earliest centuries, Venice was not a monarchy, nor a republic in the formal sense. It was something looser, an evolving set of councils and agreements, held together by necessity and geography. Still, as trade increased and the population grew, coordination became more important. Disputes between neighborhoods, issues with canal maintenance, defense against pirates, all of these required some form of centralized decision-making. By the early 700s, pressure began building for a more official political structure. The people didn't want a king. That much was clear. Kings brought armies and heavy taxes. They answered to foreign powers. Venice had seen what happened to the Italian mainland under royal control: instability, invasion, and frequent shifts in loyalty. The lagoon had survived so far by avoiding those cycles. So instead of a monarch, the early Venetians introduced a new role, the doge, from the Latin dux, meaning leader. The first doges were elected, at least in theory, by popular consent among the major families and community leaders. The role combined elements of military leadership, diplomacy, and civic management. The doge represented Venice in foreign dealings and made executive decisions at home, but his power was not absolute. From the beginning, he was expected to govern with the advice and approval of the community's elders and merchant families. The first doge on record was Paolo Lucio Anafesto, around the year 697, though the details are uncertain. His rule, and that of his successor, were mostly local, keeping peace between the islands and defending against small-scale raids from the mainland. The role was still developing, more symbolic than strategic. Over time, however, the position grew in influence. Later doges built up small administrations. They kept records, negotiated treaties, and oversaw larger construction projects. Yet, they remained fundamentally different from kings. They had no blood right, no claim to divine rule, and no personal armies. Their legitimacy came from agreement, not inheritance. This made the position both powerful and fragile. A doge who ruled too aggressively could be removed, and several were. Others were assassinated or forced into retirement. The people of Venice valued stability and caution. If a leader pushed too hard or tried to consolidate too much power, he risked losing the trust of the merchant class, which had the real influence in the city. At the same time, the idea of a central figure, someone who could represent Venice abroad and speak for the city in times of crisis, became increasingly useful. The outside world was watching. The Lombards still controlled much of the Italian mainland. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened in the west, still claimed Venice as a distant province. The Franks, under Charlemagne, were expanding from the north, bringing both military strength and religious authority. Venice was small compared to these powers, but its location made it important. In this complex landscape, the Doge acted as both a diplomat and a negotiator. Venice's leaders learned early that the safest path forward was not resistance, but balance. They paid tribute to Constantinople when necessary. They made deals with local Lombard rulers. They stayed just neutral enough to avoid becoming a target, while quietly strengthening their own internal systems. One of the most important early diplomatic moments came in the late 8th century. Charlemagne, the powerful Frankish king who would later become Emperor of the West, sought to expand his influence into northern Italy. Venice, though small, was strategically valuable, a trade port, a naval asset, and a gateway to the Adriatic. In 810, Charlemagne's son Pippin led an invasion into the Venetian lagoon, trying to bring the city under Frankish control. The Venetians, under Doge Agnello Participazio, responded not with a large army, but with clever defense. They retreated into the deeper parts of the lagoon, using their boats and intimate knowledge of the tides to resist Pippin's forces. The Franks struggled to move their troops through the muddy terrain. Supply lines broke down. Illness spread in the damp conditions. After several months of frustration, the invasion was abandoned. This event, though relatively small in military terms, marked a turning point. Venice had resisted a major European power. It had defended itself without relying on foreign aid. and it had done so using its greatest strength, the lagoon itself. Afterward, a treaty was negotiated between the Franks and Byzantines. Venice was officially recognized as a Byzantine territory, but with significant autonomy. It could govern itself, collect its own taxes, and maintain its own navy, as long as it remained nominally loyal to Constantinople. This gave Venice something rare in medieval Europe: practical independence without complete separation. Within the city, this independence fostered innovation. The doges continued to evolve. Councils grew larger and more structured. A system of checks and balances began to emerge. Laws were recorded, and basic institutions began to take root, including customs offices, naval oversight committees, and early trade guilds. The city had no aristocracy in the traditional feudal sense. Instead, influence came from commerce and stability. The leading families were not warriors, but merchants, shipowners, and financiers. Their power came from cargo lists, not swords. As Venice moved into the 9th century, its government, still centered around the Doge, began laying the groundwork for what would eventually become one of Europe's longest-lasting republics. But for now, it remained fragile. No city built on wood and mud could ever feel truly secure. A storm could undo years of labor. A shift in trade could starve the city of income. A misstep in diplomacy could bring ruin. And yet, the people trusted their system. Slowly, carefully, they adjusted. They didn't rush expansion. They watched the sea, studied the tides, and listened to the silence that came with being just out of reach from the mainland powers. Venice was not ruled by kings. It was ruled by tides, by trade, and by time. As Venice entered the 9th century, it began to leave behind its wooden beginnings. For nearly 200 years, the city had grown cautiously, raised on platforms of timber, built with soft materials, and dependent on constant repair. But with growing confidence, trade wealth, and a maturing political system, the people of Venice began to build with permanence in mind. Brick, limestone, and marble, materials that suggested stability, started to replace the wooden frames of the past. This was more than a change in construction technique. It was a declaration: Venice was here to stay. The most visible shift was in religious architecture. Churches, which had once been small, wood-framed structures, were now being rebuilt with domes, columns, and mosaics. The goal wasn't just shelter, it was presence. Venice, a city without kings or cathedrals, needed symbols to express its unity and ambition. In 828, something happened that would shape Venice's future and its image more than perhaps any other single event of the era. Two Venetian merchants, Buono de Malamocco and Rustico de Torcello, returned from Alexandria with an unusual and potent treasure, the supposed relics of Saint Mark the Evangelist. The story goes that they smuggled the relics out of Egypt hidden beneath layers of pork, which Muslim customs officials would not touch. The remains, or what were believed to be the remains, of the gospel writer were brought to Venice with great ceremony. Whether the bones were truly St. Mark's or not hardly mattered. What mattered was that Venice now had a saint, and a powerful one at that. Other major Italian cities already had their patron saints. Rome had Peter and Paul. Milan had Ambrose. But St. Mark gave Venice something different. Not just religious authority, but symbolic independence. Mark was not a local bishop or martyr. He was a figure from the earliest Christian narratives. To possess his remains was to claim a direct line to the sacred past, and, more importantly, a degree of religious legitimacy. Almost immediately, plans began for a new church to house the relics. This would become St. Mark's Basilica, though its early versions were modest compared to the grand structure we see today. The first iteration was built quickly, using local materials and a mix of Byzantine and Western architectural styles. Inside, the sacred relics were given pride of place. Over time, the basilica would be expanded, rebuilt, and redecorated, reflecting the city's rising wealth and shifting tastes. But even in its earliest form, it sent a clear message. Venice was not a temporary refuge anymore. It was a sacred city, protected by a saint, connected to God, and ready to step into the wider world. With religious prestige came more ambitious public construction. Stone embankments were added to major canals, reducing erosion and strengthening the edges of key districts. Warehouses were built to store goods from far-off lands. Paved walkways connected markets and docks, turning muddy paths into defined routes. The city's builders used Istrian limestone, a dense, water-resistant stone from across the Adriatic. It was more expensive than local materials, but could better endure the salt air and high tides. Palaces began to rise, not the massive castles of feudal Europe, but narrow, elegant homes for Venice's growing class of merchant families. These were built tall and close together, with balconies overlooking the canals and small courtyards tucked inside. The facades were decorated with carved arches and patterned brickwork, restrained but refined. The physical texture of the city changed. Where once the dominant color was the faded brown of aged wood, now there were pale stones, tiled roofs, and glints of mosaic glass. The sounds changed too. You could hear the clang of chisels on limestone, the calls of workers hauling bricks from barges, and the hum of quiet pride as the city reshaped itself. None of this happened overnight. Venice still lacked the sweeping boulevards of Paris or the walled majesty of Florence. Much of the city was still functional, compact, tangled, and practical. But with each stone laid, with each wall reinforced, the idea of Venice as a permanent, independent, and distinctive place became more solid. At the same time, the challenge of building with stone brought new risks. Heavy buildings required deeper and stronger foundations. The old wooden piles had limits. Builders began to experiment with spacing and support, placing additional beams crosswise beneath stone walls and creating layered platforms that could better distribute weight. Engineers of the time, though they wouldn't have used that word, developed a careful rhythm. They knew how much stone could be placed before a structure began to shift. They studied old buildings that had begun to lean or crack. Some of these were quietly torn down. Others were reinforced with external braces or internal support beams. In Venice, no building stood entirely still. Everything moved, slowly, with the tide. In the middle of this architectural evolution, a cultural one was also unfolding. Venice began to take its cues not from Rome or the Germanic north, but increasingly from the Byzantine east. Trade with Constantinople intensified. Venetian ambassadors visited imperial courts. Craftsmen from the east brought techniques in mosaic, metalwork, and enamel. The city's art, religion, and even clothing began to reflect a fusion of styles, a hybrid that was neither fully Western nor fully Eastern. Inside homes, wealthy families displayed icons and silk. They wore imported perfumes and embroidered robes. The city's festivals blended Christian rituals with older maritime traditions. Boat races, music on the water, floating processions lit by oil lamps. The lagoon's geography continued to define the city's mood, isolated, yet outward-facing, delicate, yet determined. Through all of this, the city remained focused on one goal: resilience. The sea was both protector and threat. Trade brought wealth, but also dependency. Every structure had to balance risk and endurance. A flood could undo a season's work. A mistaken foundation could lead to collapse. And yet, Venice had made its choice. It would no longer retreat. It would not look back to the mainland for protection or guidance. It would face outward, to the sea, to the east, and to the uncertain tides of the future. Stone by stone, the city declared its presence. Not loud, not boastful, but clear. We are here. We are standing. We are not leaving. By the 10th century, Venice had not only secured its physical place in the lagoon, it had begun to shape its political identity with equal care. Unlike the kingdoms and duchies that surrounded it, Venice continued to avoid hereditary rule. It had no crown, no papal appointment, and no noble dynasty. Instead, it was forming something rare in medieval Europe, a structured, decentralized republic held together by law, negotiation, and mutual interest. The earliest version of this system still revolved around the Doge, the elected leader of the city. But as generations passed, Venetians grew wary of the Doge holding too much power. Some earlier Doges had tried to pass the role to their sons or rule in more autocratic ways, which led to unrest. To preserve balance, the city began creating institutions that would limit, observe, and eventually surround the Doge with layers of oversight. This slow evolution was not caused by revolution or collapse. It came from gradual adjustments, the kind of careful, procedural changes that became a signature of Venetian politics. One of the first major changes came in the 10th century with the creation of the Consiglio dei Sapienti, or Council of Wise Men. Initially a small advisory body, It later expanded into the Great Council, Maggiore Consiglio, which would eventually include hundreds of members drawn from the city's merchant and professional families. Membership in the Great Council was limited to certain families, a group that would, over time, become known as the Venetian patriciate. This was not a nobility in the traditional feudal sense. These families did not own vast estates or control peasant labor. Instead, their power came from commerce, shipping, and participation in the city's administration. The goal of the system was not equality. It was stability. By formalizing which families could participate in government, Venice avoided the kind of endless factional fighting seen in other Italian cities. There were still rivalries, of course, trade disputes, personal grudges, and political alliances, but they were managed within a framework that emphasized collective continuity over individual ambition. To further limit the Doge's authority, Venice introduced new institutions like the Minor Council, a group of 6 men who advised the Doge and could overrule him. Later, the Council of 40, a judicial body, took on legal responsibilities. These councils didn't just exist on paper. They met regularly, debated policies, and issued rulings that shaped the daily life of the city. By the 12th century, a complex web of checks and balances had emerged. If the Doge wanted to make a treaty, he needed council approval. If he wanted to appoint an official, the decision passed through voting procedures. Even the election of the Doge himself became a highly controlled, multi-stage process, designed to reduce corruption and limit factional influence. Dozens of electors were chosen by lot, then narrowed down through repeated ballots. The idea was simple: no one person, family, or group should dominate the system. This system was not perfect. It was exclusionary. Only elite families could vote or hold office. It was slow. Decisions could take weeks or months. And it was deeply conservative, designed to prevent sudden change rather than embrace innovation. But for Venice, this conservatism was a strength. The Republic valued procedural consensus more than personal charisma. It distrusted heroes, avoided populists, and preferred quiet competence. This made Venice less vulnerable to coups, demagogues, or foreign puppets. Another innovation that helped solidify the Republic's character was the introduction of state secrecy. In 1196, the Venetian government created a new body, the Council of Ten. Originally temporary, it later became permanent, tasked with maintaining internal order and protecting the Republic from corruption and espionage. The Council of Ten operated quietly, with wide powers. Its records were kept private, its members rotated frequently, and its reach extended across the city. Though often feared, the council became one of the tools that allowed Venice to remain unusually stable for centuries. It monitored public officials, managed intelligence operations, and occasionally acted with swift justice when threats to the state emerged. In many cities, such a body would have turned into a tool of tyranny. But in Venice, where power was constantly diluted and divided, even the Council of Ten was just one piece of a larger system. Together, these institutions created a city-state unlike any other in medieval Europe. There were no grand parliaments or open forums. There was no universal suffrage. But there was order, deliberate, methodical, and designed to last. The Republic was not based on passion or ideology. It was based on the idea that careful, balanced governance could outlast chaos. Venice was not democratic in a modern sense. It was, however, resilient. And resilience, in a city built on water, was more valuable than any ideology. This system also allowed Venice to focus on its real strength, trade. While other powers poured resources into land wars and territorial claims, Venice concentrated on securing trade routes, building fleets, and maintaining relationships with faraway markets. It invested in port facilities, shipbuilding innovations, and diplomatic missions. These priorities were made possible by a government that, though exclusive, remained functional, predictable, and deeply invested in long-term interests. By the end of the 12th century, the Venetian Republic had taken shape. It had no king, no emperor, and no church-appointed ruler. Instead, it had a slow-moving, many-headed system of councils and committees, deeply entwined with the city's commercial elite. And while other city-states would rise and fall in waves of ambition and violence, Venice would continue, calmly, cautiously, and enduringly, into the centuries ahead. A city without land, a republic without democracy, a government without haste, and yet, still standing. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Venice had become a city defined not just by its politics or its architecture, but by its ships. In a lagoon-bound settlement with no farmland, no forests of its own, and no mineral resources, power had to come from movement, across water, through trade routes, by ship. If stone gave Venice its form, it was maritime trade that gave it strength. The sea was not only a barrier of protection, it was the Republic's greatest opportunity. The geography of Venice forced it to think beyond its borders. Its marshy islands could never support a self-sufficient population. Everything, grain, wine, meat, timber, tools, had to be imported. From the earliest days, this made Venetians skilled in negotiation and logistics. Over time, these skills evolved into one of the most sophisticated trading operations in medieval Europe. At the center of this development was the Venetian merchant fleet, a growing armada of cargo ships that moved across the Adriatic into the eastern Mediterranean and eventually beyond. By the 11th century, Venice was already trading with cities in Byzantium, North Africa, and the Levant. Its ships carried wool, glass, salt, and timber outwards and returned with spices, silk, precious metals, and rare goods. Trade deals were formalized, contracts standardized, and partnerships created between merchant families. But for all of this to function, Venice needed a way to build, repair, and manage ships at scale. That's when the city invested in something that no other city had yet developed on such a level: a centralized, state-sponsored shipyard, the Arsenale di Venezia. The Venetian arsenal began in the 12th century as a modest collection of workshops and docks. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, it would grow into one of the largest industrial complexes in the pre-modern world. Surrounded by high walls and protected by state secrecy, the arsenal was a place of constant motion. Carpenters shaped timber into keels and hulls. Blacksmiths forged nails, anchors, and rudders. Ropemakers spun thick cables from hemp. Sailmakers stitched heavy linen into canvas sheets. Warehouses stored dried wood, tar, oars, and masts, everything needed to build a fleet. The most impressive part wasn't just the scale, but the organization. Venice, always concerned with order and control, developed something close to assembly line production centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Ships were built in sections, with teams assigned to specific parts. A single galley could be completed in a matter of days during wartime, a remarkable feat for the time. In moments of crisis, the arsenal could turn out a new ship every day. Most of the work was done by state-employed laborers, not private guilds. These men, known as arsenalati, were skilled and respected workers, often from families that had served the arsenal for generations. They lived in nearby neighborhoods and formed a distinct community within the city. Though not part of the patrician elite, they were seen as essential to Venice's survival. The arsenal wasn't just a shipyard. It was a symbol. It represented Venice's ability to combine technology, organization, and public investment in pursuit of its core strength: mobility. Outside the arsenal, a different type of ship was being developed, one suited not for war, but for long-distance commerce: the round ship, or cacca. Unlike the long, narrow galleys used for speed and maneuverability, these were broad, deep-hulled vessels designed to carry massive cargoes. They moved more slowly but could travel greater distances with fewer stops. This shift allowed Venice to expand its reach across the Mediterranean and even into the Atlantic. To manage the growing complexity of trade, Venice developed a unique system known as the convoy. Instead of individual ships leaving on their own, large fleets would depart together under government supervision. These Muda convoys, as they were called, were organized by destination. One might sail to Constantinople, another to Alexandria, another to Flanders or London. Each convoy had a designated leader, official licenses, and a naval escort. This minimized the risks of piracy, ensured fair taxation, and allowed Venice to manage overseas markets more efficiently. The convoys returned with not only goods, but information. Venetian captains and merchants were expected to report on political conditions, port changes, new taxes, and trade opportunities. In this way, the state maintained a near-constant stream of intelligence about the wider world, a vital asset in a time when maps were vague and news traveled slowly. The maritime system also supported Venice's diplomatic strategy. Rather than conquer land by force, Venice preferred to secure privileges through treaties and favors. In Constantinople, it negotiated favorable customs rates in exchange for military support. In Egypt, it struck deals with Muslim rulers to maintain trading colonies. Venetian merchants were granted their own quarters in foreign cities, complete with chapels, warehouses, and legal protection under Venetian law. These outposts were not colonies in the traditional sense. They were bridges, temporary and flexible, designed to extract value without creating the burdens of occupation. Venetian power spread through presence, not permanence. As its commercial reach expanded, so did its fleet. The merchant marine and the naval fleet developed side by side, often sharing technology and even personnel. During wartime, the arsenal would shift focus to war galleys. In peacetime, it would return to building trade ships. This flexibility gave Venice a critical edge over its rivals. By the early 13th century, Venetian ships could be found in every major port of the Mediterranean. They carried more than goods. They carried the image of a disciplined, organized republic whose power came not from knights or castles, but from tide, wind, and planning. A Venetian ship, moored in a distant harbor, was both an ambassador and a warning. It said, "We're here for business, but we're ready for more." In the early 13th century, Venice found itself at the crossroads of faith, commerce, and ambition. The Crusades, vast religious wars launched by the Latin West to reclaim the Holy Land, had begun over a century earlier. But by the time the Fourth Crusade was planned, they had become increasingly complicated. For Venice, they presented not a holy mission, but an opportunity and a risk. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, had largely bypassed Venice. The city had contributed ships and supplies, but remained on the margins. Later crusades brought more engagement. Venetian fleets transported troops, negotiated port access, and managed supply chains. The Republic had no illusions about spiritual salvation. Its interest was always practical: protection of trade routes, expansion of maritime privileges, and careful avoidance of unnecessary commitments. But in 1201, when envoys from Northern Europe approached the Venetian government with a bold proposal, Venice agreed to something far larger. The Fourth Crusade had been called by Pope Innocent III, who hoped to reignite the crusading spirit. The plan was to strike at Egypt, the economic and logistical heart of the Muslim world, as a stepping stone to Jerusalem. To do that, the Crusaders needed transport, ships for over 30,000 men, horses, and supplies. They turned to Venice. The Venetian government agreed to build the fleet. The contract was specific. Venice would construct and supply ships to carry the crusading army to Egypt. In return, the Crusaders would pay an enormous sum, around 85,000 silver marks. The Venetians halted their commercial operations for over a year to prepare, dedicating the full capacity of the arsenal to this single task. But when the time came for departure, the plan unraveled. Fewer Crusaders arrived than expected. Many lacked the money to pay. The fleet was ready, but the funds were not. The Venetians, who had already made a massive investment, faced a dilemma: lose their resources or take control of the mission. They chose the latter. Doge Enrico Dandolo, a remarkable figure in his 90s, led the negotiations. Blind but sharp, he saw an opportunity. Venice agreed to forgive a portion of the debt if the Crusaders helped the Republic seize a rebellious city, Zara, on the Dalmatian coast. Zara, modern-day Zadar, was a Christian city, technically under the protection of the King of Hungary, who had also taken the cross. Attacking it would mean striking a fellow Christian power. But the Crusaders, desperate and without options, agreed. In November 1202, the combined Venetian and Crusader forces besieged Zara. The city fell. It was looted and handed over to Venice. News of the attack scandalized Europe. Pope Innocent III excommunicated the entire crusade, though he later lifted the ban under political pressure. The campaign should have continued to Egypt. But then came another diversion, this one even more dramatic. A Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos approached the Crusaders with a proposal. His father, the former emperor, had been deposed and blinded in Constantinople. If the Crusaders helped restore him to the throne, Alexios promised enormous rewards: money, military support, and the submission of the Eastern Orthodox Church to Rome. For the Venetians, the proposal was irresistible. Constantinople was not only the largest city in Christendom, it was also a key rival. A weak, indebted Byzantine Empire could open markets, grant trade privileges, and end centuries of competition. And so, in 1203, the Crusade, originally bound for Egypt, sailed for Constantinople. The city was taken twice. First, in 1203, Alexios was installed, but failed to pay what he had promised. Tensions rose. In April 1204, the Crusaders attacked again, this time not to restore, but to conquer. What followed was one of the most infamous events in medieval history. The sack of Constantinople was brutal. Crusaders looted churches, destroyed libraries, melted down icons, and stole relics. Civilians were slaughtered, nuns and monks assaulted, and centuries of Byzantine culture plundered. It was the first time Constantinople, seat of the Eastern Roman Empire, had fallen. And it had not fallen to Muslims, but to fellow Christians. Venice took its share. Doge Enrico Dandolo, still commanding the fleet, ensured that Venice received key neighborhoods, islands, and commercial privileges. Venetian agents claimed relics and artworks, including the famous four horses of St. Mark, taken from the Hippodrome and installed above the entrance to Venice's cathedral, where they remain to this day. The Latin Empire was established in Constantinople, a short-lived puppet state divided among Crusader leaders. Venice received formal control over large swaths of territory in the eastern Mediterranean, parts of Greece, the Aegean Islands, and strategic ports. Though much of this was symbolic or short-lived, it gave the Republic decades of favorable trade arrangements and influence across the Byzantine world. But the consequences were long-lasting. The Fourth Crusade permanently damaged relations between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. It also changed the image of Venice. Though the Republic claimed it had only acted pragmatically, many saw it as opportunistic, even ruthless. The papacy, while initially outraged, eventually accommodated the new reality. The Latin Empire was seen as a potential tool for church unification. Venice, meanwhile, solidified its role as the dominant maritime republic of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Fourth Crusade, in the end, had little to do with the Holy Land. Jerusalem was never reached. Egypt was untouched. But Venice emerged stronger, not because it believed in the cause, but because it had controlled the ships. This pattern would continue. For the next 2 centuries, Venice would navigate every major conflict with similar logic, avoid ideological commitment, extract economic gain, and preserve strategic freedom. The Republic would trade with Muslims, fight Christians, make deals with Mongols, and sell goods in places others feared to visit. Venice did not march behind banners. It sailed behind contracts. After the chaos of the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople in 1204, Venice stood at a strange crossroads. It had gained more territory than ever before, pieces of a broken empire scattered like puzzle parts across the eastern Mediterranean. But Venice was never built for empire in the traditional sense. It had no interest in planting flags inland or building stone fortresses deep in foreign land. What it wanted were ports, islands, entrances and exits. Venice did not seek to rule the world. It sought to connect it and to collect from those connections. This segment of Venice's story is about how the Republic created a vast commercial network, not through war and occupation, but through colonies of convenience. Small, strategic places where ships could stop, where goods could move, and where Venice could insert itself quietly into the traffic of empires. The Aegean Archipelago, the Republic's floating frontier. Following the Fourth Crusade, Venice claimed a series of islands and coastal points that had previously belonged to Byzantium. Many of these were located in the Aegean Sea, a vast, island-filled corridor between modern Greece and Turkey. Here, Venice supported the creation of what came to be known as the Duchy of the Archipelago, a semi-autonomous state led by Venetian nobles, based on the island of Naxos. These nobles, often acting independently of Venice's government, established their own courts, levied taxes, and administered justice. But they remained deeply tied to Venice in practice. They used Venetian ships, honored Venetian laws, and most importantly, opened their ports to Venetian trade. This loose model of governance allowed Venice to avoid the high cost of direct occupation while still reaping the benefits of presence. Other islands, Crete, Euboea, and parts of the Peloponnese, came under more direct control. Crete, in particular, became one of Venice's most important overseas possessions. It was large, agriculturally productive, and ideally located for ships sailing between the eastern Mediterranean and Western Europe. In Candia, modern-day Heracleon, Venice established a colonial government, built fortifications, and stationed a military presence. Venetian settlers were encouraged to migrate and intermarry with the local Greek population. Latin became the language of administration, but the majority of the people remained Greek Orthodox. To manage this complexity, Venice introduced a layered legal system, one for Venetians, one for locals, and a third for cases involving both. This wasn't done to enforce cultural dominance. It was designed to manage conflict, avoid revolts, and keep trade flowing. Ports over provinces, the strategy of selective control. Venice's empire wasn't a map full of red ink. It looked more like a set of dots and lines, ports, anchorages, trade stations, and maritime corridors. Unlike land empires, which needed borders and armies, Venice built a networked empire, where value came from movement, not mass. The Adriatic Sea, often called the Venetian Gulf, became a kind of internal lake for the Republic. Ports along the Dalmatian coast, in places like Split, Dubrovnik, and Kotor, became regular stops for Venetian convoys. Sometimes these ports were held through treaties, sometimes through garrisons, and sometimes through marriage alliances with local lords. Venice was flexible. The Republic's approach was always pragmatic. It didn't seek to eliminate local customs or religion. Instead, it respected what it couldn't change and co-opted what it could. Local elites were given titles. Merchants were offered favorable tariffs. Cities were allowed to keep their own councils, as long as Venice collected its dues and controlled the docks. This gave Venice access without liability. When piracy or rebellion flared up, the Republic responded with naval force, swift and targeted. But it rarely stayed long. It preferred contracts over conquests. Trading posts in the Muslim world, profit before prejudice. Perhaps most remarkably, Venice maintained ongoing trade relations with Muslim powers, even while other European states refused to do so. In the Egyptian port of Alexandria, in the Syrian city of Aleppo, and in Ottoman-held lands, Venice negotiated capitulations, agreements that granted Venetian merchants rights to trade, build churches, and operate under their own laws. These deals were sometimes made at the same time that popes were calling for crusades. But Venice rarely let religion get in the way of commerce. Even during wars between Christian and Muslim states, Venetian ships continued to sail. The Republic always found a way to be useful to both sides. Its merchants brought European wool, silver, and glass in exchange for pepper, silk, coffee, and spices. The goods were then carried back to Europe, where they fetched high prices. Venice took a cut at every stage, in transport, in insurance, in customs, and in warehousing. The Republic didn't care who ruled a city. It cared who controlled the port. Legal architecture, how Venice managed complexity. With so many outposts, so many different legal traditions, and such a mix of cultures, Venice needed a way to stay in control without creating a sprawling bureaucracy. It developed a system of provveditori, or overseas governors, appointed for fixed terms. These men reported back to the Senate and were subject to regular audits upon return. Instructions were detailed and exact. A provveditor might be told which taxes to collect, which treaties to respect, and which conflicts to avoid. They were discouraged from initiating warfare and forbidden from altering local religious practices. Their role was to stabilize, not to change. In each port, Venice established fondici, state-controlled warehouses where merchants could store goods, arrange deals, and live while abroad. These fondici were miniature embassies, legally Venetian territory, subject to Venetian law. They allowed the Republic to operate like a global trading company centuries before the rise of modern corporations. Cultural influence without colonization. Despite its global reach, Venice did not export its language, religion, or identity in the way that later colonial powers would. It never tried to make Greek peasants speak Italian or convert Egyptian merchants to Catholicism. It saw identity as fluid, not fixed. Instead, Venetian culture spread quietly, through architecture, fashion, and business practices. In port cities across the Mediterranean, you could find Venetian-style balconies, imported glassware, and accounting methods borrowed from the Republic's ledgers. Venetian coins circulated from Tunis to Trebizond. Venetian measurements were used in distant markets. And Venetian shipping law, detailed, pragmatic, and adaptable, became the standard in many Mediterranean courts. This influence was not the result of conquest. It was the result of consistency. Wherever Venice went, it brought predictability, safe contracts, neutral negotiations, and a focus on process over politics. This made it a reliable partner in an unstable world. By the 14th century, Venice had transformed itself into an empire without an empire, a spiderweb of trade, law, and influence stretching from the canals of northern Italy to the far edge of the Levant. It held little land, few armies, and no great hinterland. But it held routes, and through those routes, it held power. In a world that still worshipped land and lineage, Venice proved that a city could survive and even thrive by floating. In the mid-14th century, the entire known world trembled. A sickness, sudden and unstoppable, arrived on ships, clung to bodies, and spread in silence. Cities emptied, markets closed, entire families vanished. For most of Europe, the Black Death brought chaos and confusion. But in Venice, something unusual happened. The city did not collapse. It calculated. Venice was not spared, but it was prepared to think in terms of systems. And so, this segment explores how a city built on water responded to one of the deadliest events in human history, not with panic, but with precaution, planning, and policy. The arrival of the plague. The Black Death is believed to have reached Europe in 1347, arriving first in Sicily and quickly spreading along trade routes. By 1348, it was in full force across Italy. The disease moved through contact, through fleas and rats, and through the dense, unclean environments of medieval cities. Venice, a major maritime hub, was extremely vulnerable. Its docks received ships daily from the eastern Mediterranean, where outbreaks had already begun. The close quarters of urban life, the lack of sanitation, and the city's trade connections all made it a perfect host for disease. And yet, Venice responded not with religious hysteria, but with administrative logic. The government, dominated by the Great Council, acted quickly. Trade was the lifeblood of the city. It couldn't be stopped completely, but it could be regulated. Quarantine, a Venetian invention. In 1377, nearby Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, implemented a 30-day isolation period for ships arriving from infected areas. But it was Venice that expanded the practice and gave the world a new word, quarantine, derived from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. The principle was simple. Any ship arriving from a known infected region had to anchor away from the city for 40 days. During this time, the crew was observed. Cargo was not unloaded. Passengers were not allowed to disembark. Only after this period, if no symptoms were reported, could the ship proceed into the city. To enforce this, Venice built one of the first dedicated quarantine stations in the world on a small island called Lazaretto Vecchio, near the entrance to the lagoon. Later, another larger facility, Lazaretto Nuovo, was added. These islands served multiple functions. They were isolation centers, observation posts, and medical facilities. Infected persons could be treated or separated. Goods could be fumigated or stored. And most importantly, contact with the main city was strictly limited. No other city in Europe had anything like it at the time. Health boards and bureaucracy. To manage all this, Venice created the Magistrato alla Sanità, the health magistracy, one of the earliest state-run public health institutions in Europe. The board included officials known as Provveditori alla Sanità, who had the authority to inspect ships, monitor doctors, and coordinate with local parishes. These health officers maintained detailed records. They tracked the origins of ships, the symptoms of infected individuals, and the movements of travelers. In effect, Venice created a public health surveillance system, centuries before germ theory existed. Officials conducted house-to-house inspections. They organized burials, sometimes under cover of night. Bodies were moved by special boats. Grave diggers worked under strict orders and were often isolated themselves. Funerals were limited or banned entirely during outbreaks. Rather than rely solely on religious explanations, Venice treated disease as a matter of logistics. The role of religion, carefully managed. Venice was a religious society, but unlike other cities, it kept the church in balance. Processions, where large crowds gathered in the name of saints, were restricted during times of plague. While neighboring cities encouraged flagellants or mass prayers, Venice placed limits on gatherings. recognizing them as potential sources of spread. Instead, the city encouraged private devotion. Monasteries were ordered to remain closed to outsiders. Priests were allowed to minister to the sick, but with precautions. Even sacraments were adjusted to reduce contact. This wasn't disbelief, it was containment. Social structure and the spread. Despite its planning, Venice couldn't avoid the human costs of the plague. The disease struck hardest among the poor, who lived in crowded quarters and could not isolate. Wealthier families, including many in the nobility, often fled to the countryside or retreated to private villas in the lagoon. This created tensions, but Venice's government, composed of merchants rather than monarchs, understood the need for visible action. The Senate passed emergency relief measures. Grain was distributed, price controls were enforced, and some taxes were suspended. Ships carrying food were given priority clearance. Private citizens were encouraged to donate to public efforts. Hospitals, rudimentary by today's standards, were expanded. Charitable confraternities, long present in the city, coordinated with officials to deliver aid. And when entire families died, their property was often claimed by the state to fund further relief. Even in death, the system kept working. Long-term impact. The repeated waves of plague, especially between 1348 and the early 15th century, reshaped Venice's demography. The city's population declined sharply, from perhaps 100,000 to under 60,000 at its lowest. But Venice recovered more quickly than most. Why? Partly because it kept its trade routes open, using its quarantine system to balance risk and reward. Partly because its administrative structure allowed for fast, coordinated responses. And partly because it had the discipline to treat the crisis not as divine punishment, but as a policy problem. In later centuries, Venice's public health model would be copied by other cities. The idea of state-managed quarantine, of designated isolation facilities, and of systematic health reporting all began here. The plague also deepened Venice's habit of pragmatism. It reminded the Republic that survival depended not on ideals, but on infrastructure. The same logic that held back the tides was now applied to sickness. In the end, the plague left Venice scarred, but strengthened. Its people mourned, its markets slowed, and its rituals were altered. But its institutions endured. The city that had learned to live with the sea now showed it could also live with disease, not by avoiding it, but by managing it. In a city famous for gondolas, canals, and silent stone palaces, there was one place where things did not move quietly. It clanged. It smoked. It echoed. This was the Arsenale di Venezia, the Venetian arsenal, a massive shipyard and industrial complex that not only built ships, but changed how things were built altogether. In this segment, we'll explore how the arsenal transformed Venice from a city of merchants into a naval and economic power, pioneering practices centuries ahead of their time. From assembly line production to state-run manufacturing. The arsenal wasn't just a building. It was a machine. A city that floats, a shipyard that roars. Venice had always been a maritime republic. Its wealth depended on trade, its borders lay across water, and its enemies, pirates, rivals, crusaders, came by sea. From the earliest days, shipbuilding was essential. But by the early 12th century, something shifted. Venice needed more than just ships. It needed a fleet, and not just in times of war. The demands of trade convoys, pilgrim transports, and diplomatic missions meant that Venice required constant access to reliable vessels. So the city created the Arsenal, a dedicated state shipyard that would become the heart of Venetian industrial power for centuries. More than a shipyard, the Arsenal wasn't a dock with a few carpenters. It was an enormous, walled complex, eventually covering over 100 acres, staffed by thousands of workers known as arsenalati. It had its own foundries, rope makers, sawmills, storage depots, and even forests under state control to ensure a steady supply of timber. At its peak, the arsenal could produce a fully equipped galley, sails, oars, armaments, and all in a matter of hours. Not because of miracles, but because of organization. Each ship passed through a series of production zones, where teams specialized in one task: cutting wood, shaping hulls, forging nails, fitting rigging. It wasn't identical to modern assembly lines, but the concept was the same: division of labor, repeated action, and centralized oversight. This made the arsenal one of the first examples in the Western world of pre-industrial mass production. A workforce with structure. The Arsenalati were not private craftsmen, but state employees. They worked for the Venetian government, not for profit. Their wages were regulated, and their tools and materials were owned by the Republic. They received food allowances and lived in nearby neighborhoods, often in Castello, one of the city's oldest quarters. The government kept detailed records of each worker's skills, seniority, and performance. It was not unusual for multiple generations of the same family to work at the arsenal. There were apprenticeships, promotions, and even pensions. This created a sense of institutional loyalty. The workers were part of a system that gave them security, status, and purpose. During times of war, they could be conscripted to fight aboard the very ships they built. But in peace, they were the quiet gears of Venice's greatest engine. The Arsenalati even had their own chapel, their own festivals, and a level of pride that blurred the lines between laborer and artisan. Secrecy and state power. The arsenal was also a military zone. It was guarded, monitored, and closed to foreigners. Designs for new ships were considered state secrets. The Republic knew that its survival depended not just on trade, but on control of the sea. Some galleys were built for speed and agility, to escort convoys or chase down pirates. Others were massive, with multiple decks, built for siege or blockade. The largest ships, called galleasses, carried both sails and oars and were packed with artillery. Each vessel was stamped with the Lion of St. Mark, Venice's symbol, and registered in government ledgers. No merchant could build a ship of war without permission. No captain could modify a design without inspection. Even the city's doge, the head of state, had to seek approval before commissioning a private vessel. The arsenal was not a place for improvisation. It was a place for control. Logistics at sea. Venice's approach to naval operations was methodical. Ships did not leave port randomly. They sailed as part of organized convoys known as mud, which were scheduled, insured, and protected by armed escorts. Each convoy was tracked by the state. Ship capacity, cargo values, departure times, and return routes were recorded and reviewed. The government issued licenses and sometimes required ships to carry specific goods, like grain, salt, or weapons, depending on market needs or diplomatic strategy. The arsenal made all of this possible by maintaining a reserve fleet, which could be activated during times of war or crisis. It also produced the smaller vessels used for patrolling the lagoon, ferrying officials, and delivering messages across the empire. In this way, the arsenal wasn't just a factory. It was the backbone of the Venetian state. Technological edge and innovation. Venetian engineers were constantly improving ship design. They experimented with hull shapes, studied wind patterns, and developed better sail configurations. They borrowed from Byzantine, Arab, and even Norse traditions, adapting what worked, discarding what didn't. Naval architects used standardized templates, wooden frames that allowed faster reproduction of successful models. They began to store tools in dedicated locations, label parts, and document procedures, all practices that foreshadowed modern engineering. Even the cranes and pulleys used to lift ships into the water were examples of mechanical innovation. By the 15th century, the arsenal had become Europe's most advanced naval production center. A silent symbol of power, what made the arsenal truly remarkable was not just its output, though it was immense, but the fact that it represented a new kind of power. Not feudal, not religious, not hereditary. It was power built on organization, technology, and planning. Other kingdoms had castles. Venice had a machine. Even the city's enemies took notice. When the French King Henry III visited the arsenal in the late 16th century, he was awed by what he saw. Thousands of workers moving in rhythm, great ships rising from the docks like statues from stone, and the quiet efficiency of a city that had turned war into a science. This was not the romantic Venice of carnival masks and serenades. This was industrial Venice, controlled, calculated, and centuries ahead of its time. In the end, the arsenal helped Venice defend itself, project power, and dominate trade routes. But more than that, it changed how cities could think. It showed that a republic, with no king, no empire, and no land army, could still shape history, if it could build. And Venice, above all, knew how to build. To understand how Venice became rich, powerful, and strangely untouchable for centuries, you need only follow the scent of spices. Today, pepper is ordinary. Cloves and cinnamon sit in kitchen drawers. But in the medieval world, they were worth more than gold. and Venice knew how to move them. This is the story of how a city with no fields, no orchards, and no spices of its own came to dominate the spice trade of Europe. Not by growing, but by connecting. Why spices mattered. In medieval Europe, spices weren't just a luxury. They were status, medicine, preservation, and religion all in one. Pepper helped disguise the taste of aging meat. Nutmeg was believed to ward off plague. Cloves were chewed to freshen breath. Cinnamon was used in religious rituals and elite kitchens alike. They came from far away. India, Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, the Spice Islands, in present-day Indonesia, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Moving them to European markets was dangerous, expensive, and slow. But the demand was endless, especially from the noble and merchant classes who used spices as symbols of refinement. Enter Venice. Venice, the middleman republic. Venice didn't sail all the way to India. Instead, it acted as a middle node, a funnel that gathered goods from the east and redistributed them across Europe. This network depended on a few key points. Spices typically arrived in Alexandria, Beirut, or Damascus, controlled by Arab or Mamluk powers. From there, they were carried to eastern Mediterranean ports, where Venetian merchants were waiting. Venice had something few others did: diplomatic agreements with Muslim rulers. The Venetians were allowed to operate in their territories in exchange for fees, tributes, or exclusive trade arrangements. Venice kept careful neutrality, avoiding open conflict with Islamic powers when possible, even during crusading periods. This allowed it to create a stable, long-distance supply chain. The Fondaci controlled trade hubs. To manage this complex web of deals and goods, Venice established Fondaci, state-supervised warehouses and lodging houses for merchants in foreign cities. For example, the Fondaco dei Turchi later in Venice served as the home and commercial center for Ottoman merchants. Earlier, Venetian traders maintained similar setups in Alexandria and Tyre. In these centers, Venetian merchants could store goods, settle accounts, and conduct business under the eye of local authorities and under the protection of Venice's diplomatic arrangements. This gave Venice an edge in consistency and scale. The spice fleet and the annual scheduled spice convoys were timed carefully. Venice didn't operate on guesswork. It created a calendar of movement, especially for its spice fleets. Each year, ships would leave Venice in spring, catch the prevailing winds across the Adriatic and Aegean, and arrive in Levantine ports by early summer. By late summer or early autumn, they would return loaded with goods, not just spices, but also silks, cottons, glass, perfumes, and exotic dyes. Spices were measured by the sack, valued by the ounce, and taxed at every step. Venice's government took its share, but also stabilized prices by regulating how much pepper, for example, could enter the local market at once. It was both commerce and choreography, financing the trade. Spice trading required immense capital. Ships had to be outfitted, crews paid, foreign bribes accounted for, and goods purchased in bulk, often months before any profit returned. Venice responded by innovating in finance. Wealthy families would invest in voyages, buying shares in a merchant's trip in exchange for a portion of the proceeds. This was a form of early joint stock investment, centuries before the Dutch or English East India companies. Venetian banks also offered letters of credit, so merchants didn't have to carry bags of coin across pirate-infested seas. These letters could be cashed in distant cities, backed by the reputation and stability of the issuing house. This allowed for a cashless, credit-based trade network long before the term global finance existed. The pepper monopoly. By the late 14th century, Venice controlled over 60% of all the pepper entering Europe. Other spices followed similar patterns. Competitor cities like Genoa or Pisa tried to break in, but lacked the same infrastructure, diplomatic access, or political unity. Venetian merchants formed guilds that specialized in spice handling, from storage to grinding, packing, and re-export. These were tightly regulated. Merchants had to report their inventories. Pricing was supervised. Fraud was punished. All of this kept prices high, supply stable, and Venice at the center of the map. Impact on the city. The wealth generated by the spice trade left physical marks on Venice. Look at the palaces lining the Grand Canal. Many were built with money from pepper and clove. Family fortunes were measured in trade returns. Dowries were based on spice profits. Even the city's cuisine changed. Venetians developed a unique blend of Eastern and Western flavors, sweet and sour sauces, saffron risottos, cinnamon wines. Many of these dishes had roots in the goods that passed through their ports. Art and literature, too, absorbed the imagery of distant lands. Eastern fabrics, Persian tiles, Indian carpets, all became part of Venetian life. A city that never left the lagoon became a mirror of the world. Trouble on the horizon, but there were cracks forming. The Ottoman Empire was growing stronger and began to squeeze Venetian influence in the eastern Mediterranean. And across the Atlantic, something even more serious was happening. In 1498, a Portuguese navigator named Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa. For the first time in centuries, a European power had direct access to spices without relying on Venice or its eastern partners. Prices began to fluctuate. Venice's control weakened. The web began to unravel. But for more than 2 centuries, the city had lived at the center of one of the most profitable networks in human history, not because of military conquest, but because it understood movement, timing, and diplomacy. Venice didn't discover spices. It didn't grow them, but it knew how to move them, quietly, efficiently, and profitably. In a world powered by caravans and sails, that was enough to build an empire. Power doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it whispers, listens, and waits. That was the Venetian way. In a world of crusades, empires, and endless wars, Venice managed to stay neutral, flexible, and above all, profitable. And it did so with something few other states mastered: diplomacy as a system. In this segment, we explore how Venice built a state not on conquest or faith, but on information, negotiation, and strategic silence. A republic among monarchies in medieval and Renaissance Europe, most powerful states were monarchies. Kings led armies. Dynasties fought for crowns. Religion was often fused with politics, especially in the Catholic world. Venice was different. It was a republic ruled by councils, elected officials, and a doge whose power was limited by law. It had no king, no claim to divine right, and no ambitions to convert its neighbors. This gave it a unique diplomatic flexibility. Where other nations took sides in religious or dynastic conflicts, Venice stayed technically neutral, even when neutrality required incredible balancing acts. Embassies as information centers. By the 15th century, Venice had one of the most sophisticated diplomatic corps in Europe. It stationed permanent ambassadors, known as bailli or envoys, in key cities: Constantinople, Cairo, Paris, London, and later Madrid and Vienna. These weren't just ceremonial figures. They were informants, trained to observe, report, and adapt. Every few weeks, they sent back long, detailed dispatches called relazioni, describing everything from troop movements to court gossip, local laws to food prices. These reports were archived, studied, and used to shape policy. The Venetian government created a system where diplomacy was data, not just words. A preference for treaties over war. Venice didn't avoid conflict because it was peaceful, but because war was bad for trade. War disrupted supply chains, closed markets, and forced expensive naval campaigns. So, the Republic mastered the art of the deal. Venice would offer tribute rather than provoke a fight. It paid off pirates. It offered technical support, access to goods, or commercial privileges in exchange for peace. When war couldn't be avoided, like during the Crusades or the Ottoman-Venetian Wars, Venice fought, but always with careful cost calculation. It rarely overcommit. If the price of holding a colony was too high, Venice would sell it, lease it, or abandon it strategically. This wasn't cowardice. It was realism. The Ottoman relationship. Perhaps the greatest example of Venetian diplomacy was its long, complicated relationship with the Ottoman Empire. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans became the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. Most Christian states responded with panic, hostility, or crusading zeal. Venice responded with negotiation. Despite religious differences, Venice signed multiple trade agreements with the sultans, securing access to ports like Constantinople, Alexandria, and Smyrna. It paid customs dues, hosted Ottoman envoys, and maintained a permanent Venetian embassy in Istanbul. Even when wars broke out, and they did, both sides usually returned to the table quickly, understanding that commerce outweighed conflict. Venice knew that being useful was better than being holy. Intelligence and spying diplomacy wasn't just formal. Venice maintained a network of informants across Europe and the Near East. Merchants, travelers, translators, and even clergy sometimes acted as eyes and ears for the state. The Venetian government paid well for useful information: naval construction in Genoa, troop numbers in Hungary, weather patterns in the Aegean. These pieces of data were logged, cross-referenced, and stored in official archives. This passive intelligence system allowed Venice to react before threats became crises. It also made Venice seem eerily well-informed, a reputation that discouraged some enemies from acting impulsively. Controlled public image: Venice carefully managed its international image. It presented itself as a calm, stable, secular republic, uninterested in dynastic squabbles. Foreign visitors were often impressed by the order of its streets, the silence of its gondolas, and the serenity of its government rituals. When diplomats visited, they were received with ceremony but also clear limits. The Doge never left the city. Council decisions were made collectively. Gifts were modest. This avoided the dangerous flattery and rivalry that plagued royal courts. Even when Venice participated in major events, like crusades or papal councils, it sent delegates, not warriors. It stayed close to power, without becoming entangled in it. Using marriage and culture sparingly, unlike many royal courts, Venice rarely used marriage diplomacy. There were no grand alliances sealed with weddings. Instead, the Republic focused on economic bonds and legal treaties. Cultural diplomacy was also subtle. Venetian art, architecture, and scholarship were admired across Europe, but were rarely exported directly as tools of influence. Instead, Venice became a place where others came to learn, to trade, and to observe. The city's neutrality made it a meeting ground for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Its tolerance, limited but real, gave it access to multiple worlds at once. The price of silence: this quiet diplomacy had costs. Venice was sometimes accused of cowardice, opportunism, or godlessness. Other powers didn't always trust its neutrality. At times, Venetian refusal to commit to one side or another left it isolated. And when major powers realigned, such as during the Reformation or the rise of Atlantic empires, Venice found itself sidelined, its careful diplomacy suddenly less useful in a new world of larger states and faster ships. But for over 5 centuries, Venice avoided many of the disasters that devastated its neighbors. While other states burned their capital in civil wars or religious purges, Venice preserved its system, quietly, cautiously, and, when needed, invisibly. Venice proved that power doesn't need to conquer. It can persuade, observe, and adapt. Its diplomats were not saints or spies, but professionals in an age before that word existed. They understood that in a city built on water, the goal was not to push forward, but to stay afloat. And that's exactly what Venice did. Venice was a city without farmland, without natural defenses, and without royal bloodlines. What it had, instead, was law. From its earliest days, Venice understood that to survive in an uncertain world, especially as a republic, it needed not just trade and ships, but a reliable structure to govern them. Law in Venice was not just for criminals or contracts. It was the glue of the republic, holding together hundreds of families, thousands of traders, and millions of coins worth of risk, all balanced on platforms above a shifting sea. In this segment, we'll explore how Venice created a legal system not only to rule its own citizens, but to maintain control over commerce, colonies, and conduct across the known world. A city built on order. The idea of law in Venice began not with ideology, but with necessity. In the early centuries of the lagoon settlements, there was no centralized power. Each island, each parish, often governed itself. But by the 10th century, as Venice's wealth and connections grew, the need for a unified legal code became urgent. The Doge, though a powerful symbol, could not rule by decree alone. Venice chose a path of codified councils, written law, and rotating power, all designed to prevent corruption, favoritism, or domination by a single clan. Laws were debated, voted on, archived, and then enforced, not through brute force, but through social pressure and strict public accountability. The Grand Council and the legal machine. At the heart of Venetian governance was the Magier Consiglio, the Great Council, made up of hundreds of men from patrician families. This was not a parliament in the modern sense, but it was an enormous legislative body. This council, Passed laws, especially those affecting commerce, navigation, and taxation. Appointed officials to run the various arms of the state. Served as a check on the power of the Doge and each other. From this council emerged specialized committees, each tasked with aspects of law enforcement, maritime law, criminal justice, trade regulation, public health, and even morality. No law could be passed quickly. Everything was debated, reviewed, and approved by multiple bodies. This slowness was intentional. It made it nearly impossible to push through a law that benefited only a few. Maritime law, the soul of the system. Nowhere was Venetian law more advanced than on the sea. Venice's maritime code, refined over centuries, governed not only shipbuilding and navigation, but contracts, partnerships, insurance, and liability. Key features included chartered voyages. Merchants and shipowners signed detailed agreements specifying risk, cost, and return. Shared risk investment. Known as commenda, this allowed wealthy investors to fund voyages in exchange for a share of the profits. If the ship sank, the investor lost their stake, a natural check on reckless behavior. Dispute resolution. Special maritime courts settled conflicts between sailors, merchants, and foreign traders. Verdicts were based on precedent and practical outcomes. Port regulations. Ships entering Venice had to report cargo, submit to inspections, and pay port dues. Bribery and undeclared goods were punished, not just with fines, but sometimes with confiscation. The result was a trustworthy, predictable system. Traders from across Europe preferred Venetian routes because they knew they'd be protected even when disputes arose. Contracts and trust. In a world where much of commerce depended on months of travel, Venice had to create tools for enforceable contracts. Merchants could sign binding agreements before they ever left port. The government kept records, validated seals, and maintained notaries who served as legal witnesses. There were even rules for what to do if a merchant died abroad, or if cargo was damaged in foreign ports. Venice built legal continuity across oceans. More impressively, Venice exported this trust. Venetian contracts were often accepted in other cities because they came with the implied enforcement of the Republic. The Council of Ten, justice and secrecy. One of the most famous and feared legal institutions in Venice was the Council of Ten. Created in the 14th century after a failed coup attempt, this small group of elites had sweeping authority to investigate threats to the state. The council could conduct secret trials, interrogate suspects under controlled conditions, order imprisonment, exile, or even execution, though rarely used. This body operated in parallel with the open legal system. While the main government handled everyday law, the Council of Ten was the guardian of the Republic's survival. It was controversial, even inside Venice, but many believed it kept the system honest by watching the watchers. Laws for foreigners. Venice hosted thousands of foreign merchants, sailors, and diplomats each year. It needed a system that could manage their presence without disrupting order. The Republic created special zones, such as the Fondaco dei Tedeschi for German traders, where foreigners lived under Venetian oversight, but retained some autonomy. Foreigners were subject to local law while in Venice, required to register business dealings, often taxed differently, protected, at least officially, from abuse or discrimination. This mix of control and openness allowed Venice to attract global commerce while minimizing risk. Penalties and public shame. Venetian law often relied less on imprisonment and more on fines, exile, or public embarrassment. For instance, a merchant found guilty of fraud might be banned from doing business for a year. A noble who broke voting rules might be barred from council service. An official caught in corruption might be publicly named and removed, even if not imprisoned. The idea was to preserve the dignity of the system rather than resort to violence. Reputation in Venice was everything, and legal penalties often targeted a person's standing, not just their body. Legal innovation. Over time, Venice introduced several legal innovations, including standardized weights and measures to prevent fraud. Quarantine laws during plague years, which later influenced public health codes across Europe. Commercial archives where contracts, ship manifests, and court decisions were stored and cross-checked. A postal system used by officials and merchants alike, monitored for security. Even when Venice began to decline politically, its legal system remained respected and emulated, a framework for cities that wanted commerce without chaos. In Venice, law wasn't just a tool. It was the architecture of the state. It replaced kings, armies, and religious orthodoxy with documents, councils, and consistent rules. A floating city cannot afford cracks in its foundation. Venice survived by writing its stability into every contract, every port ledger, every court decision, and making law not the enemy of freedom, but its protector. There are few materials as silent, fragile, and mysterious as glass. Smooth as water, solid as stone, it captures light and color, yet it's born in fire and shaped by breath. For centuries, Venice was the capital of glassmaking in the Western world, not just a producer of cups and windows, but the jealous keeper of an industrial secret. On the tiny island of Murano, a community of artisans turned sand and ash into shimmering objects of beauty, wealth, and diplomacy. In this segment, we journey into Murano, not as tourists, but as quiet observers of a system designed to protect, control, and perfect a single craft. The origins of Venetian glass. Glassmaking was not invented in Venice. The techniques had ancient roots, stretching back to Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later Rome. But by the 13th century, Venice had gathered skilled craftsmen, trade access to raw materials, and a culture of refinement that gave its glassmakers a clear edge. The real turning point came in 1291, when the Venetian government ordered all glass furnaces to be moved out of the city and onto the nearby island of Murano. The official reason was fire prevention. Venice, built of wood and tightly packed, was especially vulnerable to flames. But the move also allowed the government to concentrate control and quietly impose restrictions on what would become one of its most valuable industries. Murano, an island of fire and silence. Murano became a self-contained world where generations of glassmakers lived, worked, and rarely left. The state supported them, protected them, and, crucially, forbade them from immigrating. Master glassmakers were offered legal privileges, such as tax exemptions or honorary titles, protection from certain guild rules, the ability to pass on their workshop and secrets to their sons. But these privileges came at a price. They were forbidden from sharing trade secrets with foreigners. They needed government permission to leave the Republic. Violators could face severe penalties, including confiscation of property, imprisonment, or worse. Venice wasn't just protecting an art. It was protecting a monopoly. The secrets of Murano glass. Venetian glassmakers developed techniques that were unmatched in the medieval world. These included cristallo, a perfectly clear, colorless glass that resembled rock crystal; latamo, milky white glass, resembling porcelain, used in imitation of Chinese wares; filigree, vetro of filigree threads of colored glass twisted into patterns; gold leaf glass, glass infused with thin gold leaf, shimmering in the light; millefiori, 1,000 flowers, a technique that layered colors into complex patterns. These processes were closely guarded, and even within Murano, the knowledge was divided among families and workshops. No single artisan knew everything. This fragmentation made industrial espionage nearly impossible for a while. Diplomacy and gift economy. Venetian glass was not just sold, it was gifted as part of the Republic's diplomatic efforts. Elaborate chandeliers, goblets, or mirrors were sent to foreign courts to impress, flatter, and quietly signal Venice's refinement and reach. Because Murano glass was difficult to replicate, it became a symbol of luxury and loyalty. Owning it meant you had access to Venice, or at least the favor of someone who did. Some monarchs even attempted to poach Murano artisans, offering them land or titles. The Venetian government responded with bribes, threats, and sometimes spies to bring defectors home or punish them abroad. The Mirror Wars. One of the most sought-after Venetian exports was the glass mirror, a technological marvel at the time. Early mirrors were made of polished metal or crude glass backed with mercury. Venetian mirrors, however, were perfectly smooth, brilliantly reflective, and enormously expensive. France, under Louis XIV, tried to break the monopoly. In the 1660s, French agents successfully lured several Murano craftsmen to Paris, where they helped establish the Sank glassworks, the beginning of France's own mirror industry. This was a blow to Venetian pride, and a reminder that no secret lasts forever. Venice redoubled its efforts to shield its remaining knowledge, but the glass monopoly had begun to fracture. The culture of the glassmakers in Murano were not mere laborers. Over time, they became a cultural class of their own. Many rose to considerable wealth. Their children married into merchant families. Some glassmakers were knighted, a rare honor for craftsmen. Their signatures began to appear on works of art. Inside Murano, rivalries were fierce between families, between styles, between generations. Each workshop guarded its techniques, even from neighbors. At the same time, Murano had a shared pride, a sense that its output was not just commerce, but Venetian identity itself. Decline and survival. By the 18th century, Venice's political power had declined, and with it, the ability to enforce its secrecy. Competing glass industries emerged in Bohemia, England, and France. Murano could no longer control the global market. But what it lost in exclusivity, it retained in prestige. Tourists began to visit Murano not for secrets, but for beauty. Glassblowers opened their doors, offered demonstrations, and began selling directly to visitors. In time, Murano adapted. It became less of a secret island and more of a living museum, a place where history still glows in the fire. The legacy of control. Murano's glass story is a rare example of industrial protectionism in a pre-modern world. Venice understood, centuries before patents and intellectual property laws, that knowledge had value, and that controlling knowledge could build a city's fortune as surely as gold. Glass is brittle, but the system that protected it was not. It was structured, generational, and deeply embedded in the state. Today, we can still hold a Murano glass goblet in our hands, thin, shimmering, impossibly light, and feel the quiet pressure of centuries behind it. The breath of men who never left the island. The silence of secrets passed from father to son, and the careful watch of a republic that knew. In a world ruled by swords and ships, glass could be power. The beauty of Venice has always seemed a little unreal. Floating palaces, silent canals, golden churches. But behind its elegance lies a long history of fear, especially in the face of a force that neither ships nor laws could hold back: plague. Venice, like many medieval and early modern cities, faced repeated outbreaks of bubonic plague. But unlike many of its neighbors, it responded with a kind of early scientific determination, creating systems of containment, quarantine, and public health that were centuries ahead of their time. In this segment, we'll explore how the Republic of Venice met one of its greatest invisible enemies, not through denial, but through control, and how, ironically, this city built on openness and trade became a pioneer in isolation. A city open to the world, and to disease. Venice's very strengths made it vulnerable. By the 14th century, it was a maritime hub, connecting Europe with the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and beyond. Ships arrived daily with goods, spices, and fabrics, but also with rats, fleas, and, unknowingly, the bacteria that carried plague. The first great outbreak to reach Venice came in 1348, the Black Death. It swept through Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. Venice was no exception. Contemporary accounts describe bodies floating in canals, mass burials, and entire neighborhoods abandoned. Doctors could do little. Priests died administering last rites. Government records simply go silent, overwhelmed by the scale of loss. But in the aftermath, something changed. Venice, shaped by bureaucracy and experience, began to think not just of mourning, but of prevention. The first quarantine in history. In 1377, just a few decades after the first wave, the Venetian-controlled port of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, issued an extraordinary order. All arriving ships and travelers had to isolate for 30 days before entering the city. This idea, called Trentino, was based on simple logic. If disease arrived by ship, then perhaps time, alone, at sea or on an island, could slow its spread. Later, the isolation period was extended to 40 days, or 40 giorni, from which we get the word quarantine. Venice itself soon adopted this practice, formalizing the process and creating a dedicated space for it, the Lazaretto Vecchio, the islands of the dead and the living. The Lazaretti were small islands near the entrance to the Venetian lagoon, isolated, windswept, and easily guarded. There were two main facilities: Lazaretto Vecchio, the old quarantine, primarily for the sick and dying; Lazaretto Nuovo, the new quarantine, for the healthy but suspected. Merchants, sailors, and goods could be held for weeks here, observed by guards and physicians. Infected ships were cleaned, cargo was fumigated with vinegar or smoke, and people were monitored for symptoms. These islands were not prisons. They were early public health centers, designed to keep the city safe without completely shutting down trade. Surveillance and sanitation. Venice created a board of health, one of the first in Europe, responsible for tracking disease, issuing orders, and inspecting incoming vessels. Public health inspectors would examine the bill of health issued by a ship's port of departure, interview the crew for signs of illness, confiscate suspicious goods, even isolate entire buildings in the city if plague broke out inside. The state also introduced public sanitation measures, waste collection from canals and streets, regulations on animal slaughter and market hygiene, bans on certain religious processions that could spread disease. In short, Venice moved from reaction to prevention, decades, even centuries, before germ theory, masks, doctors, and ritual. If you've ever seen the long-beaked plague doctor mask, you've seen a piece of Venetian history. These doctors wore a wide-brimmed hat, symbol of their profession, a waxed robe to repel infection, gloves and boots for protection, and the famous mask, with a curved beak often filled with herbs or vinegar-soaked sponges. While these outfits were of limited effectiveness, they symbolized a formal response to crisis. The doctor was no longer just a personal healer. He was an agent of the state. Still, fear was widespread. When plague came, the city often ground to a halt. Ships were turned away, markets emptied, and people took to prayers, charms, or private isolation. Art, memory, and gratitude. Venice did not forget its brush with death. In 1576, after a terrible outbreak, the Senate vowed to build a church in thanksgiving if the plague ceased. It did, and so rose the Church of the Redeemer, Il Redentor, designed by Andrea Palladio and still standing on the island of Giudecca. A century later, after another outbreak, the city built Santa Maria della Salute, the Saint Mary of Health, whose elegant dome now dominates the Grand Canal. Each year, the city held public processions to these churches, not in hysteria, but in solemn memory, acknowledging the danger that had passed and the city's fragile endurance. Repeated waves, repeated lessons. Venice faced plague outbreaks again and again. In 1468, 1575, 1630, and even into the 18th century. Each time, it applied the same principles: contain, not deny; isolate, not punish; document, not ignore. These responses did not eliminate plague, but they did reduce its reach, and more importantly, they institutionalized a logic of prevention. Long before the world spoke of public health, Venice practiced it, not out of charity, but out of survival. The irony of a city built on contact. In many ways, Venice was the opposite of a quarantined city. It lived through exchange, movement, and touch of goods, people, and ideas. But precisely because it understood these flows so well, it knew how to interrupt them when needed. Its strength was not in building walls, but in knowing when to slow the gates. That knowledge saved it, not entirely, but more than most. When we walk through Venice today, we see romance. But under the bridges and domes, there is a quieter legacy, one of watchfulness, adaptation, and restraint. In the stillness of quarantine islands, in the records of inspectors, in the lines of marble chapels, Venice left a trail of how a republic faced death, not with panic, but with planning. In a quiet corner of Venice, beyond the elegant palaces and echoing churches, lies a space that once thundered with labor: the Arsenale di Venezia, the Venetian arsenal. Today, it is still and mostly silent, its vast gates closed to tourists and its canals calm. But for centuries, this was one of the busiest industrial complexes in the world, where wood and iron, rope and canvas were turned into fleets. The arsenal was not just a shipyard. It was a military engine, an economic driver, and perhaps the first example of large-scale, state-run manufacturing in Europe. In this segment, we'll walk slowly through the rise, operation, and influence of the arsenal, how it worked, who labored there, and how it helped Venice become a republic with reach far beyond its shores. Foundations of a naval city. Venice's geography demanded ships. With no farmland to feed itself and no roads to reach allies or markets, Venice's survival depended on maritime access. By the 12th century, it had not just mastered trade routes. It had also realized that military control of the sea lanes would be essential to protect its wealth. That meant building not one ship, but many. And for that, Venice needed organization. The arsenal was born sometime around 1104, starting small and growing steadily over the next several centuries. It eventually became a walled, guarded, state-run complex, covering nearly 60 acres, an enormous footprint in a city where space was always scarce. A city within a city. The arsenal was not open to the public. It had its own walls, its own gates, and often its own rules. Only authorized workers, supervisors, and state officials could enter. Inside, it was a hive of constant activity. Woodworkers cut and shaped timbers. Blacksmiths forged nails, hinges, and fittings. Ropemakers twisted long lines from hemp. Sailmakers stitched huge sheets of canvas. Painters sealed hulls with pitch or decorated galleys with Venetian colors. At its height, the arsenal could employ up to 16,000 workers, a massive number for a pre-industrial city. They worked under the supervision of state engineers and military planners, who tracked every beam, bolt, and oar. Nothing was left to chance. The Venetian state, famously efficient, ensured that its shipyard was not a guild enterprise, but a public machine. Standardization and speed. One of the arsenal's most extraordinary features was its system of standardized ship components. Long before the term assembly line existed, Venice had already implemented its core principles. Instead of building a whole ship from scratch at one station, the arsenal produced pre-cut ribs and hull panels, standard-sized planks and beams, interchangeable masts and rudders. These parts could then be assembled quickly, even in parallel, using coordinated teams. During times of war, especially in the 16th century, the arsenal was capable of producing a fully outfitted galley in a single day. This was not just impressive, it was revolutionary. Other European powers still relied on individual craftsmen or private shipyards. Venice had invented state-scale logistics. The arsenalati, workers of the arsenal. The people who labored in the arsenal were known as arsenalati. They were not nobles, but neither were they ordinary laborers. Their connection to the state gave them a certain pride, and, often, job security across generations. Some were skilled craftsmen. Others worked in teams to haul timber, launch ships, or prepare weaponry. Most lived in the nearby neighborhoods of Castello, where life moved to the rhythm of the arsenal bell. Because their work was tied to the military, the arsenalati were often exempt from certain taxes and had protections other workers didn't enjoy. They were also seen as part of Venice's defense, not just builders, but defenders of the Republic. Innovations in management. The arsenal was not only about ships, it was also about control. The Venetian Senate maintained meticulous records of production, costs, and materials. Every tree felled in Dalmatia was logged. Every shipment of tar from Cyprus was tracked. Inventories of anchors, cannons, and sailcloth were regularly updated. This level of bureaucratic oversight allowed the Republic to plan ahead for wars, deploy fleets quickly, and maintain naval dominance over rivals like Genoa or the Ottoman Empire. Some historians see the arsenal as a proto-industrial revolution, a place where centralized planning, workforce coordination, and material standardization came together centuries before the steam engine. Not just ships. Strategy. The arsenal's ships were designed not only for speed or trade, but also for projection of power. The galleys it produced could row or sail, ideal for Mediterranean combat. Later, it began to produce galleasses, hybrid warships with more firepower. During peacetime, smaller merchant vessels were built to support the Republic's trade empire. The arsenal allowed Venice to maintain a permanent, professional navy, something very few medieval states could afford. And crucially, it was located inside the city, protected by walls, canals, and watchtowers. Enemies could not easily destroy Venice's naval backbone. It was embedded in its heart. Cultural and political symbol to Venetians, the arsenal was more than a factory. It was a symbol of order, strength, and civic pride. Dante, in his Inferno, even describes hell's bubbling pitch as like the vats of the Venetian arsenal. Writers, painters, and diplomats all noted its scale, discipline, and ingenuity. Foreign visitors were both impressed and intimidated. They saw in the arsenal not just a shipyard, but a state that understood the future. The gates of the arsenal, adorned with statues and lions, were designed to remind everyone. This was a city that could build and protect its own destiny. Decline and echoes like much of Venice's power, the arsenal's influence faded over time. By the 18th century, changes in naval warfare, particularly the rise of large oceanic sailing ships and global empires, outpaced Venice's capacity to keep up. The once thundering arsenal grew quieter. By the time Napoleon arrived in 1797, the Republic's fleet was already shrinking. Yet the memory of the arsenal lived on. In later centuries, naval powers like Britain, France, and the United States would adopt similar principles: centralized naval dockyards, state oversight, standardized parts. Venice had done it first. When you walk near the arsenal today, you might only hear birds or distant footsteps. But beneath that silence lies the outline of an early machine of power, built not of gears and pistons, but of timber, discipline, and vision. Here, amid brick walls and mossy docks, the Republic once forged ships not only to float, but to rule. The year 1453 marked a deep tremor in the foundation of the Old World. When Constantinople, the once mighty capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, finally fell to the Ottoman Turks, it sent ripples across every European court. But nowhere was the reaction more layered, more urgent, or more conflicted than in Venice. For centuries, Venice had balanced itself between East and West. It traded with Christian powers, but also thrived through careful diplomacy with Muslim states. It was Catholic, yet independent of papal control. It supported crusades, but only when they aligned with its economic goals. The fall of Constantinople placed Venice at a crossroads, spiritually, economically, and militarily. In this segment, we explore how the Republic reacted to the end of the Byzantine Empire and how it faced the rise of a new imperial force, the Ottoman Empire. A deep and complicated partnership before 1453, Venice's relationship with Constantinople was long and tangled. After the Fourth Crusade in 1204, which Venice helped redirect against Constantinople itself, the Republic gained massive commercial privileges in Byzantine territory. Venetian merchants settled in the city, built churches and warehouses, and even governed parts of former imperial lands. Despite these gains, Venice never fully abandoned cooperation. In the centuries that followed, it continued to trade with the Byzantines, often supplying them with ships, military advisors, and goods in exchange for strategic footholds and tax exemptions. By the 15th century, however, Byzantium had shrunk. Constantinople was little more than a shadow of its former glory, surrounded by rising Turkish power on all sides. Venice watched carefully. Its wealth depended on access to the Black Sea, on routes through the Bosporus, and on a Byzantine buffer between Islam and Europe. That buffer was crumbling. The rise of the Ottomans by the early 1400s, the Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Mehmed II, had become a dominant force in Anatolia and the Balkans. Venice, recognizing this new reality, had already begun to negotiate with the Ottomans. It signed commercial treaties, hoping to preserve its eastern markets even under new rulers. Venice was pragmatic. Ideology mattered, but trade routes mattered more. Still, when it became clear that the Ottomans were preparing to besiege Constantinople, Venice hesitated. The Doge and Senate debated. Should they send aid? Should they remain neutral? Could they risk alienating the Turks? In the end, a small Venetian fleet was dispatched, too late and too limited to change the outcome. The fall and the aftermath. On May 29, 1453, Ottoman forces stormed the walls of Constantinople. The city fell after a brutal siege, and Emperor Constantine XI died fighting. The Byzantine Empire was no more. For Venice, the consequences were immediate. Venetian merchants and residents in the city were killed, captured, or expelled. Trading stations were seized. Access to the Black Sea was cut off. More broadly, the fall triggered fear across Christendom. The idea that a Muslim empire now controlled the ancient Roman capital seemed to many a sign of apocalypse. But Venice, despite mourning its losses, remained cool-headed. It moved quickly to negotiate with the victors. Pragmatism over panic. By 1454, Venice had already begun talks with Sultan Mehmed II. By 1456, it had signed a new treaty, restoring many of its commercial privileges. The Republic agreed to pay annual tribute for access to Ottoman ports, including Constantinople, which the Turks now called Istanbul. In return, Venetian merchants could resume operations under the Sultan's protection. This deal was mutually beneficial. Venice preserved its eastern trade network. The Ottomans gained a steady stream of luxury goods, naval supplies, and tax revenue. Not everyone in Venice approved. Some nobles and church leaders demanded a crusade to retake the city. But the Senate, ever practical, chose stability over vengeance. Shifting strategies with Byzantium gone and the Ottomans now the dominant power in the east, Venice adjusted its maritime strategy. It reinforced its fortresses in Greece, Cyprus, and Crete, aware that war could still erupt. It invested more heavily in the arsenal, preparing for future naval conflict. It expanded its espionage and diplomatic networks, embedding agents in Ottoman courts and cities. Venice also began to look west, strengthening ties with Spain, France, and the Papal States, even while maintaining delicate relations with the Sultan. The Republic was walking a tightrope, but it had done so for centuries. Survival in the lagoon had always required flexibility. Cultural and emotional reverberations. The fall of Constantinople also stirred intellectual and emotional undercurrents in Venice. Many Greek refugees fled to Venetian territories. Scholars, artists, and clergy brought with them ancient manuscripts, Byzantine religious traditions, new ideas that would eventually fuel the Renaissance. Venice, already a center of publishing and art, became even more vibrant, enriched by this influx of Eastern culture. At the same time, artists and writers mourned what had been lost. In paintings, Constantinople appeared as a distant memory, golden domes swallowed by darkness. In sermons, it became a symbol of warning. Even great cities can fall. But Venice did not retreat into sorrow. It absorbed the lesson, adapted, and moved forward. A calculated relationship in the decades following 1453, Venice remained both a partner and a rival to the Ottoman Empire. It fought short wars over key islands and ports. It competed with Ottoman merchants in places like Alexandria and Aleppo, but it also benefited from stability in the eastern Mediterranean, which the Ottomans largely enforced. The Republic was neither friend nor foe. It was strategic, always weighing gain against risk, always choosing action based on outcomes, not ideals. This approach defined much of Venice's foreign policy for the next century. A new map of power after the fall of Constantinople, the old map of Europe no longer made sense. The balance of Christian and Muslim power had shifted. Trade routes began to move. The future would no longer be shaped just by popes and emperors, but by sultans, bankers, and sailors. Venice understood this more quickly than most. Though it had lost allies and privileges, it had kept its access. While others called for crusades, Venice built ships. While others lamented the East, Venice sailed into it. It did not win every war, but it did survive the collapse of Byzantium, and in doing so, shaped the next phase of Mediterranean history. The fall of Constantinople was not the end of Venice's story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where adaptation, not allegiance, became the key to staying afloat. In the silent waters of its lagoon, the Republic plotted not revenge, but relevance. There are scents that changed the course of history. Cinnamon, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, once commonplace in today's kitchen shelves, these spices were once as precious as gold, as guarded as secrets, and as fought over as territory. And for centuries, Venice held the keys to their journey from the east to the palaces and markets of Europe. In this segment, we follow the quiet but powerful world of Venetian spice trade, how it was built, sustained, and finally challenged. This is a story of merchants, middlemen, and maritime maps, all connected by fragile routes and fragile deals. As with much of Venetian history, the tale is not told through battles or banners, but through ledgers, cargo, and contracts, through the controlled rhythm of ships sailing eastward and returning with treasure more aromatic than any coin. Why spices mattered. Before refrigeration, spices were not just luxuries, they were necessities. They preserved meat, masked unpleasant tastes, and were deeply entwined with medicine, ritual, and status. A small bag of pepper could buy a servant's freedom. Nutmeg, grown only in the tiny Banda Islands of Indonesia, was more expensive than silver. To eat spiced food in medieval Europe was to display wealth, reach, and refinement. Yet the spices themselves came from far-off places: India, Ceylon, the Moluccas. Getting them to Europe required an intricate chain of trade. Venice mastered that chain, not by conquest, but through clever positioning. Venice, the middleman of the medieval world. Spices arrived from the east along ancient caravan routes, the Silk Roads, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean trade network. Muslim traders dominated these early connections, bringing goods to Alexandria, Beirut, and Constantinople. Venetians rarely traveled deep into Asia themselves. Instead, they waited at the edge, at Levantine ports, and bought in bulk. Their strength lay in volume, timing, and financing. Once loaded into Venetian galleys, the spices were sold at huge markups in Italian cities, resold to merchants from France, Germany, or England, packaged into prestige items, sachets, scented oils, and even religious relics. The entire European spice market was, for a time, channeled through the Rialto, Venice's commercial heart. Contracts, risk, and secrecy. Spice trading was not a casual affair. Each voyage was financed through complex contracts, often with multiple investors. Merchants bought shares in ships, shared risk, and spread profit. Prices were volatile. A war in Syria, a storm in the Indian Ocean, or an embargo by the Mamluk Sultan in Cairo could change everything. To manage this uncertainty, Venice created insurance mechanisms, merchant guilds, state archives of pricing, supply, and competition. Information was a commodity. Venetian traders jealously guarded their sources and monitored competitors. They bribed port officials, intercepted letters, and even ran spy networks in rival ports. Venice understood early that knowledge was power, and it wielded it like a dagger hidden beneath a velvet robe. The spice warehouses of Venice. In Venice, spices were stored in tightly controlled magazzini, official warehouses near the Grand Canal. The air around them, travelers wrote, was fragrant with exotic smells, especially in summer. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi, originally a merchant inn for German traders, also became a spice hub. Goods flowed in and out under state supervision. The Republic taxed spice imports, regulated weights, and even standardized packages. Quality control mattered. A dishonest batch could damage not just a single merchant, but Venice's entire reputation. Even artists and apothecaries relied on the flow of these imports. Saffron-colored fabric and paint. Clove oil was used in dentistry. Mace-flavored sauces served in courts from Vienna to Paris. The Portuguese disruption. By the late 15th century, Venice's dominance was clear and increasingly fragile. Other European powers were growing curious, even desperate, to bypass the Muslim Venetian monopoly. Then came a breakthrough. Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, sailed around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and reached Calicut, India. This changed everything. Portugal now had direct access to spice sources. They could trade pepper and cinnamon without relying on Levantine ports, and therefore, without Venice. Venetian senators understood the threat immediately. The Senate's records from the early 1500s are full of anxious discussions about the Portuguese, how to respond, how to adapt, how to survive a shift that felt like an earthquake. A trade war from afar. Venice could not attack Portugal directly. Instead, it lobbied other powers to resist the newcomers. It tried to broker new deals with Egyptian Mamluks. It offered better prices. It even cut profits temporarily to stay competitive. But the world was moving. The Atlantic was becoming the new frontier. Lisbon, not Venice, began to fill with spices. Northern European merchants started sailing directly to Iberia, bypassing the Adriatic altogether. By 1510, the writing was on the wall. Venice would no longer be the sole gateway to the east. It was no longer irreplaceable. Shifting tactics, preserving wealth, yet Venice did not collapse. Instead, it pivoted. The Republic began, investing in manufactured goods like glass, textiles, and printed books, expanding holdings in the eastern Mediterranean, including Cyprus, developing high-end luxury exports to balance its declining imports. It also focused more on banking, shipping logistics, and ship design, evolving from a spice-trading middleman into a broader economic force. Still, the emotional and symbolic blow was felt deeply. The spice trade had been the golden thread that tied Venice to Asia, power, and prestige. Losing its monopoly was like losing a crown. Not fatal, but hard to forget. A fragrant legacy. Even after its dominance faded, Venice remained closely linked to the memory of spice. In paintings, exotic goods remained symbols of opulence. In cuisine, saffron risottos and peppered meats recalled older connections. In language, the Venetian dialect preserved words drawn from Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit. The city, in many ways, had scented the Renaissance, not just with perfume, but with possibility. As twilight fell on Venice's spice empire, the ships still sailed, the markets still hummed, and the merchants still bargained. But the routes had shifted, and with them, the world. And yet, if you walk along the Grand Canal today, past the old warehouses, some say you can still smell a hint, faint but present, of cinnamon in the air. In a city defined by ships and spices, something new began to stir in the 15th century, quieter than sails in the lagoon, yet far more disruptive. It was made not of wood or silk, but of ink, paper, and metal. The invention of the printing press transformed Europe, but few places embraced it as rapidly and strategically as Venice. By the year 1500, this watery republic had become the printing capital of the world, producing more books than any other city in Europe. In this segment, we explore how Venice, with its mix of commercial ambition, cultural appetite, and cautious governance, turned the printed word into a powerful tool. A new era had begun, and Venice positioned itself at the center of it. A city ready for printing. The groundwork had already been laid. Venice was a city of readers, scribes, and scholars. Its universities, monasteries, and merchant houses all relied on manuscripts, painstakingly copied by hand, often illuminated and expensive. But copying was slow. One book might take a year to complete. In contrast, a printing press could produce hundreds of copies in weeks. When Johannes Gutenberg introduced movable type in the 1440s, the idea spread quickly. Venice adopted it early, not just out of curiosity, but because it saw profit, power, and prestige. By the 1470s, printing presses were humming in Venetian workshops, their metal type clicking and clinking like the oars of a galley slicing through water. Aldus Manutius, the scholar printer. No figure better represents Venetian printing than Aldus Manutius, a humanist, editor, and publisher. Arriving in Venice in the late 15th century, Aldus founded the Aldine Press, a workshop that produced some of the most elegant, accurate, and compact books of the Renaissance. He pioneered italic type, which mimicked cursive handwriting and saved space. The octavo format, smaller books that were portable and affordable. Carefully edited editions of Greek and Latin classics, many of which were printed for the first time. His goal was noble, to preserve ancient knowledge and make it available to scholars and students across Europe. His motto? For the learned and the unlearned alike. Yet Aldus was also a businessman. He understood the value of exclusivity. He secured copyrights, hired skilled editors, and fought plagiarists who tried to imitate his designs. In Venice, even books were subject to competition and control. A publishing boom by the early 1500s, there were more than 150 printing houses in Venice, a remarkable number for a city of its size. Books poured out in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Italian. Titles ranged from classical philosophy and theology scientific texts and mathematical treatises, herbals and medical guides, poetry, travelogues, and even cookbooks. Venice exported these books across Europe. The Grand Canal became a route not just for spices and silk, but for ideas. The city's printers formed a guild regulated by the state and competed for skilled typesetters, translators, and engravers. Even woodcut artists, who created the illustrations, found steady employment. To own a Venetian book was a mark of sophistication. Censorship and control, but not everything could be printed freely. The Venetian government, always sensitive to reputation and order, began to worry about the spread of dangerous ideas, heresy, sedition, and political dissent. So it established systems of pre-publication licensing and post-publication review. Some books were banned outright. Others were edited or annotated. A few were burned. The tension was clear. On one hand, Venice thrived on open trade and free thought. On the other, it feared chaos, religious scandal, or the wrath of foreign powers. The Inquisition, too, began to take interest in what came off the presses. Printers had to balance innovation with caution, creativity with compliance. Still, compared to many regions, Venice remained relatively open. Its pragmatic leaders understood that knowledge, like salt or silk, was most profitable when not entirely controlled. Hebrew and Arabic printing uniquely, Venice also became a center for non-Christian publishing. Jewish scholars, barred from printing in many parts of Europe, found in Venice a rare opportunity. In 1516, the Republic formalized the Venetian ghetto, the first of its kind, but allowed its Jewish residents to engage in publishing, trade, and banking. Venetian presses produced Hebrew Bibles and commentaries, Talmudic texts, grammar books for students of Semitic languages. Later, some printers also experimented with Arabic type, though with more limited success. This multilingual, multicultural output made Venice an intellectual crossroad, a place where Latin scholastics, Greek philosophers, Hebrew theologians, and Arabic translators briefly shared paper and ink. The look and feel of a Venetian books were known for their craftsmanship. Their bindings were often made of leather or vellum. Their pages, despite age, remained crisp and legible. Their typefaces, elegant, balanced, would influence European typography for centuries. Collectors prized these editions. Libraries sought them. Even long after the decline of Venice's political power, its books remained symbols of clarity and quality. They were artifacts of an age when the city was not just a marketplace of goods, but a marketplace of minds. A quiet revolution, the printing press, did not create Venice's spirit, but it did reflect it. Here was a city that had always lived by networks of trade, diplomacy, and now, information. Here was a people who navigated change not with fear, but with adjustment. Books, unlike battles, are slow revolutions. They unfold over decades, not days. But in that slow unfolding, they shift the world. Venice understood that. It printed with purpose, sold with skill, and guarded its literary legacy with care. Today, those early books still rest in libraries and museums. Their pages may be yellowed, but their words remain as steady as tides. In a city that rose from water, ideas became its new foundation, silent, stacked, and waiting to be read. Venice was a city of trade, of ships, spices, books, and ideas. But with every ship that docked, something else sometimes arrived: disease. In a city so tightly woven, where thousands lived pressed between canals and narrow alleyways, illness could spread silently and quickly. No illness shaped the rhythms of Venetian life more deeply or more fearfully than the plague. Known today as the Black Death, but recurring many times afterward, it left a lasting scar not just on bodies, but on the governance, architecture, and soul of Venice. In this segment, we explore the recurring waves of plague that struck the city, how Venice tried to understand it, contain it, and ultimately live with it. This is not the story of defeat or cure. It's the story of adjustment, of learning to survive with fear and to plan in the face of the unknown. The arrival, 1348. The plague first arrived in Venice in 1348, the same year it swept across much of Europe. It likely came by ship, as it often did, hidden in the fleas of rats, or perhaps in the breath of infected sailors. The disease moved fast. Fever, swelling, blackened skin. People died within days, sometimes within hours. Contemporary records tell of mass graves dug on islands, streets emptied of all but the sick, church bells ringing endlessly, entire households vanishing within a week. As many as 50% of Venetians may have died in the first wave. Trade halted. Fear grew. The lagoon, once full of life, became eerily still. Venice responds unlike some cities, which collapsed into chaos or fled their infected neighborhoods. Venice organized. The city's leaders, the Serenissima, as the Republic was called, understood early on that panic helped no one. They formed committees. They issued laws. And most importantly, they began to build a system. In 1423, Venice created something that had never existed before: the Lazaretto Vecchio, the world's first quarantine island. The Quarantine Islands. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. That was the length of time incoming ships, passengers, or cargo had to wait on offshore islands before being allowed into the city. The Lazaretto Vecchio was for the sick. Later, the Lazaretto Nuovo was built for the healthy, but possibly exposed. These islands functioned like early hospitals and inspection stations. They had dormitories, supply chains, and burial grounds. Priests and doctors worked there, many of whom died in service. Ships were inspected by officers known as health magistrates, a new class of official born from necessity. Quarantine wasn't perfect, but it worked well enough. Venice had found a way to slow the spread, not through medicine, but through logistics and discipline. Ritual and response in times of plague, spiritual life intensified. Churches held daily masses. Processions wound through the empty streets. Survivors promised donations and good works. Two great churches were built as acts of collective vow. Il Redentor, the Redeemer, commissioned in 1577 after a particularly severe outbreak. Designed by Palladio, it was meant as a thank you to God for deliverance. Santa Maria della Salute, built after the 1630 plague, a stunning domed basilica that still watches over the Grand Canal. Each year, Venice still holds solemn processions across temporary bridges to these churches, echoes of an older fear, honored with calm gratitude. Social impacts plague did not kill evenly. The poor suffered most. Narrow quarters, poor sanitation, and malnutrition made their bodies more vulnerable. But even the rich were not immune. Entire noble families vanished. Guilds lost masters. Orphans filled convents. The city responded with charitable institutions like the Scuole Grandi, which gave food and care to survivors. New laws about inheritance to manage the sudden gaps in family lines. Rebuilding efforts that reshaped parts of the city, wider streets, fewer crowding courtyards, and even limits on certain types of gatherings. Venice adapted again and again. Plague Doctor's Venice gave rise to one of history's most iconic figures, the Plague Doctor, dressed in a long coat, gloves, and a beaked mask filled with herbs and vinegar. They were often not real doctors, but hired city officials whose job was as much about observation and record-keeping as it was about healing. They kept logs of the infected, marked homes for quarantine, helped manage the burial process. Their outfits, strange by modern standards, were early attempts at protective gear, an effort to stay safe when little was understood about contagion. The final major outbreak in 1630, a final devastating outbreak hit Venice, killing tens of thousands. This time, it came from the mainland, brought in by soldiers during the War of the Mantuan Succession. Despite better quarantine measures, the disease broke through. By this point, the Venetian population was already smaller than it had been in its golden age. The plague accelerated that decline. Recovery was slow, but from that moment forward, plague gradually faded as a threat, replaced by other challenges: economic shifts, military tensions, and political stagnation. The city had survived, but it was quieter, older, and more cautious. Lasting legacies. The plague left behind a unique urban architecture, shaped by isolation and crowd control, a legacy of public health infrastructure, admired by other cities' deep rituals of memory, still honored centuries later. Venetians learned to live with fear, not by fleeing, but by formalizing it, turning uncertainty into policy and sorrow into ceremony. Even today, the quarantine islands remain, some abandoned, some repurposed. If you visit the Lazaretto Vecchio, you'll find silent courtyards, old stone beds, and faint traces of names carved into walls. A city built on water had learned to float above death, not by denying it, but by designing around it, with grace, control, and a quiet sense of endurance. Venice was many things: a republic, a trade empire, a naval power, but perhaps one of its most unusual features was how it ruled itself. Unlike monarchies or populous city-states, Venice developed a carefully layered system of councils, committees, and secretive offices designed to avoid both tyranny and chaos. In this segment, we explore the hidden machinery of the Venetian Republic, the government behind the gilded masks, the rules behind the ceremonies. We'll walk through the echoing halls of the Doge's palace and into the sealed rooms where strategy, suspicion, and surveillance held the Republic together. This is the story of the most serene republic, as it liked to be called, and the quiet control it exercised over every part of itself. The Doge, a symbol with boundaries at the center of Venetian political life, stood the Doge, the elected head of state. His image was everywhere, on coins, paintings, official documents. He wore a distinctive horned cap and lived in the Grand Palazzo Ducale, right next to St. Mark's Basilica. But despite the trappings, the Doge was not a king. He had almost no independent power. He couldn't make laws. He couldn't lead armies on his own. He couldn't leave the city without permission. The Doge was bound by strict tradition and constant supervision. Even his funeral plans were regulated by law. Why so many limits? Because Venice remembered history, especially the risks of giving one man too much power. The Doge was a figurehead, a living symbol of unity, surrounded at all times by councils that actually held the reins. The Great Council. Many hands on the wheel. Real authority rested in the Great Council, a massive legislative body made up of noble families. By the 14th century, it included over 1,000 members. Every male from an approved patrician family had a seat for life. In theory, it was inclusive, at least within the aristocracy. In practice, it functioned like a parliament with ceremonial and administrative roles. The council voted on laws, approved budgets, elected other key bodies, including the Doge. It was large, slow-moving, and deliberate by design. No one voice dominated. The Republic prized consensus, even if it took weeks. The Council of Ten, power in secret beneath the surface of this open, aristocratic model, however, lay something more shadowy. The Council of Ten. Founded in 1310, originally as a temporary committee to investigate a failed coup, the Council of Ten became permanent and powerful. It operated in secret, oversaw matters of state security, and had sweeping authority. It could intercept and read private letters, investigate corruption and treason, prosecute nobles, doges, even ambassadors. Its members were elected from the Great Council but rotated regularly. To guard against collusion, they served for short, limited terms and were barred from re-election for a time. The Ten were aided by a network of secret informants, called Giustizia Segreta, often anonymous. Their reports dropped into special locked boxes known as Bocche di Leone, or lion's mouths, found throughout the city. These mouths, carved into stone walls, had inscriptions like, for denouncements against those who conceal goods, or commit fraud, or cheat the state. The three inquisitors of state, even the Council of Ten, was not the final word. In some extreme matters, particularly espionage and treason, they called upon a smaller, even more secretive body, the three inquisitors of state, I Tre Inquisitori di Stato. These men had near unlimited authority. They could try cases in absolute secrecy, conduct surveillance abroad, sentence prisoners without appeal. They were feared and anonymous. In many cases, their identities were kept hidden, even from the people they judged. Yet this system, harsh as it may seem, was remarkably effective. It avoided civil war, suppressed conspiracies, and kept Venice relatively stable while other city-states collapsed into coups, assassinations, and tyrannies. The role of surveillance, what kept this system running, was not just law, but observation. Everyone in Venice watched everyone else. Servants could report on their masters. Merchants were expected to report suspicious activity at sea. Foreign ambassadors were often followed, their meetings noted. Yet somehow, this did not breed widespread paranoia. It became part of the rhythm of life, accepted as necessary for the Republic's survival. There were even punishments for spreading rumors, a way to prevent gossip from undermining public trust. Checks and balances. Unlike most medieval and Renaissance governments, Venice operated under a deep culture of balance. No one person or office could act without counterweights. For example, the Doge could not open official letters without witnesses. The Council of Ten had to be approved by the Senate to declare war. Judges could be investigated by independent magistrates. Even public festivals were monitored by designated officials to ensure no political factions used them for subversive purposes. In a way, Venice governed itself the same way it sailed its ships, with many oars, all pulling in coordination, avoiding sharp turns or sudden shifts. A government built to last, this complex system worked. For centuries, Venice avoided military coups, popular uprisings, religious civil wars, dynastic struggles. The same aristocratic families remained in power, yes, but they ruled under rules they themselves respected and refined. From the outside, it looked like a maze. From the inside, it felt like ritual, steady and structured. Venetians believed deeply in their republic. Even when the Doge was crowned, he swore a long oath limiting his own power, a striking gesture in a time when most leaders claimed divine right or hereditary rule. Legacy today, visitors to the Doge's palace can walk through its long, silent corridors. There are chambers for councils, cells for prisoners, and hidden passageways used by guards and scribes. The architecture itself reflects the government's values. Open courts next to secret chambers. Ornate facades covering sober inner walls. A fusion of spectacle and sobriety. In the Republic of Venice, appearance mattered, but so did mechanism. The Republic lasted over 1,000 years, not because of its fleet or its fortunes, but because of the way it governed itself. Cautiously, collectively, and, when necessary, in secret. It wasn't a perfect system, but in a world of feuding kingdoms and collapsing empires, Venice found stability, not through power, but through process. As we reach the end of this long journey through the history of Venice, from its muddy beginnings in the lagoon to the final lowering of its golden standard, one is left not with the feeling of collapse, but of completion. Venice did not burn. It did not crumble beneath foreign siege or fall into civil war. Instead, it stepped quietly off the stage, bowing with grace as the curtain of empire descended across Europe. What remains is not just a record of conquests or a list of doges. What remains is an atmosphere, a sense that somewhere, in the rustle of gondola oars and the silent stare of old palazzos, the echo of something once magnificent still hums. Let's take a final, gentle walk through what Venice was and what it became. A city born of necessity. Venice was never meant to exist in the way that other cities were. It was not founded with a royal charter or as a military outpost. It was a retreat, a place of refuge in a time of collapse. Out of mudflats and marshes, its first settlers built something both practical and improbable, a floating community bound by need. That practicality, over time, turned to ingenuity. And ingenuity, layered with generations of experience, became identity. Venice was born defensively, but it grew assertively, mastering trade, diplomacy, and naval engineering. It was an empire of logic as much as ambition, a place where everything was measured, weighed, debated, and aligned to the interests of the Republic. The power of process. Unlike the kingdoms that surrounded it, Venice was ruled not by divine right, but by procedure. Its councils, laws, and rituals were complex, sometimes unnecessarily so, but they gave the city stability. It was this consistency, more than military might, that made the Republic endure for over a millennium. That doesn't mean Venice avoided ambition. It fought wars, built fortresses, and extended its power across the Mediterranean. But it did so with a long view, preferring advantage to domination, profit to pride. Even when enemies threatened from all sides, Venice chose balance over escalation. Its survival strategy was never glory, it was relevance. The culture of reflection. Perhaps Venice's most lasting achievement was not its empire, but its aesthetic. Art, music, architecture. These were not afterthoughts, but essential expressions of the city's identity. In its golden centuries, Venice created not just paintings, but entire atmospheres, compositions of sound, space, light, and water. It made memory visible. Even as its power declined, its cultural importance grew. Tourists came to see what had been, and in doing so, they helped preserve it. Venice became a place people wanted to remember, even if they had never seen it before. The quiet fall. The fall of Venice was not loud. There were no flaming towers, no looting mobs. When Napoleon's forces entered the city in 1797, the Doge resigned without resistance. The Republic dissolved itself with ceremony, not conflict. It was, in its own way, fitting. Venice had lived by protocol. It would end by protocol, too. But that final act was not the end of the city, only the end of its autonomy. Venice would pass through the hands of Austria, then Italy. It would survive floods, fascism, and tourism. And through it all, it would continue to float. A living memory. Today, Venice remains one of the most visited cities in the world. Its streets, narrow, sun-dappled, and filled with echoes, are not just a backdrop, but a reminder. They remind us that power does not always last, but beauty can endure. That cities are not just economies or militaries. They are stories, made solid in stone and canal. The real legacy of Venice is not in its victories or its ships. It is in the feeling it gives, the blend of grandeur and stillness, of light on water, of history that feels alive, yet just out of reach. In a world that moves faster every day, Venice remains slow, measured, a little worn, perhaps, but elegant still. Like the soft closing of a long, well-read book, the story of Venice ends not with triumph or tragedy, but with a whisper, a breath of salt air, a glint of gold beneath a fading sky, and silence, where once there had been song.